Hello, very good morning and thanks for joining us here on The Breakfast Show this Monday. Our top story this hour. The stage is set for coalition building in Germany after yesterday's election. The country's Conservatives came out on top with almost 30% of the votes. But the story of the night was the surge in support for the far right, placing them in second position. Now the question is whether the established parties will continue the long-held convention of a firewall blocking the AfD from joining a coalition. Sky's Europe correspondent Siobhan Robbins reports.
He's been waiting for this his whole life. Finally, celebrations for former banker Friedrich Merz. He knows he's almost certainly going to be Germany's next chancellor after his Conservative bloc won the most votes in the election.
As soon as possible, we need to get a viable government together in Germany, a government capable of working based on a majority, because, ladies and gentlemen, the world outside is not going to wait for us.
The hard work starts here. First of all, they've got to form a government, and then they have to solve the huge challenges facing Germany: an ailing economy, migration, global unrest, and the rise of the far right. That last threat was on these protesters' minds even before negotiations for the next government properly began. Outside the far-right AfD election party, supporters and opponents clashed. Some terrified that a long-standing taboo would be broken, meaning the far right could share power.
I think they will grow, but I'm really afraid. So I did appointments for passports so we could leave if we need to. Because I'm really afraid because of my son. He's disabled, as I mentioned, and I'm massively afraid of how worse it will be.
But inside, the AfD was celebrating a night of historic results. The first far-right party to come second since World War II. Their leader underlining their willingness and hinting at their right to help rule.
We have doubled our votes. They wanted to cut them in half. The opposite has happened. And I must say one thing. Our hand will always remain outstretched for participation in government, to implement the will of the people, the will of Germany. We are ready to participate in government.
Currently, a far-right coalition isn't an option, so the next possibility is offering this guy, former Social Democrat Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and his party a seat at the top table. But Scholz quickly ruled himself out of any deal as he and his SPD supporters absorbed their bitter defeat. And some voters are also keen to avoid another broken coalition.
I'm pessimistic right now, because of the situation that we will not have clarity. We will again go into a coalition, and again we're going to have half-hearted decisions.
And in the end, it seems getting elected will be the easy part. Governing will be much harder. With the populists waiting in the wings, there is no room for error. Siobhan Robbins, Sky News, Berlin.
Well, today, on the anniversary of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, Number 10 sets out a fresh round of sanctions, at this time targeting the country's billionaire oligarchs. Well, Mari's here to discuss this. Great to see you as always, Mari. So what can we expect then from Sir Keir Starmer and his team today?
So today the Home Office is announcing these new measures, these new kind of rafts of sanctions, as it were. And this is all about what the government calls elites close, with known kind of close links to the Kremlin. Some would argue oligarchs. And so really they want to make it easier to exclude them from the UK, stop them entering the UK, so expanding the already existing exclusion criteria. So they talk about, for instance, anyone who provides significant support to the Russian state, those who owe their status or their wealth to the Russian state, or those who enjoy access to the highest levels of the Russian state. And what they're arguing is that this is in the interests not only of, Ukraine and the war that is ongoing there, but also this is in our UK national security interests as well. And that is, I think, really what Dan Jarvis, the Home Office Minister, is going to be talking about this morning. They're going to talk about how blocking access to those who undermine national security here in the UK, those who denounce Western values in public while enjoying them in private, and also acting as a tool for Russian states, so those who are enabling the expansion of Russian aggression should be sanctioned. Now, many would argue that actually this is a great idea and, they would welcome this government announcement. Other people would argue, why haven't you done this sooner? Why have you only decided to do this now? If this was so essential, if this was so tough on Russia, why would you not do it now? Obviously, as you outlined, it's the 3-year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, we're trying to get some clarity on exactly when we'll be hearing from the Foreign Secretary, but we do expect Foreign Secretary David Lammy to be announcing this sanctions package, and we do expect a statement in the House of Commons as well in relation to that.
Thank you, Mari. Just want to bring you a bit of breaking news. This is from, obviously, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, marking the 3rd anniversary of that invasion of their country. And he says he's proud of the absolute heroism of Ukrainians. This is the very latest from the President, obviously marking that 3rd anniversary of the invasion from Russia to Ukraine, saying that he's proud of the absolute heroism of Ukrainians. OK, let's take a look at today's other news for you this Monday. Palestinian militant group, that's Hamas, says it will not hold further talks with Israel on the next phase of the ceasefire agreement until prisoners who were due to be freed on Saturday are let go. Israel said it delayed the release of more than 600 Palestinian prisoners as it wanted guarantees from Hamas that more hostages will be freed without what they called humiliating ceremonies. The White House has backed Israel's decision, saying it's an appropriate response to Hamas's treatment of hostages. A body has been found in the search for missing runner Jenny Hall. The 23-year-old was last seen on Tuesday leaving her home in Barracks Farm, County Durham. Officers say the body was found in a remote area of Teesdale and don't believe any of the circumstances are suspicious. A British couple in their 70s have reportedly been arrested by the Taliban in Afghanistan. Peter and Barbie Reynolds have run educational programmes in the country for 18 years. Their children say they were detained earlier this month, but the reasons for their arrests is unknown. Pharmacists are warning patients that services may be reduced or cut off entirely unless the government provides more funding. The National Pharmacy Association says issues like the national insurance rise mean pharmacists in England now face £250 million of unplanned costs come April. The number of homes in Britain valued at £1 million or more has risen by 30% over the past 5 years. It's according to property firm Savills. And 1 in every 42 homes in Britain is valued at £1 million plus. That rises in London, of course, to 1 in every 11 homes, with the capital recording the biggest increase in £1 million homes. Now we're expecting an update on the Pope's health shortly. The Vatican says he remains in a critical condition, having also now developed a kidney problem. Lisa Holland has the latest for you from Rome.
Pope Francis is being treated at the Gemelli Hospital, where he is alert but showing signs of early kidney failure. He remains on oxygen as he continues to battle pneumonia in both lungs. Sunday at the Vatican had to go on, even without the pontiff. Usually he appears in person at these windows. Instead, the Vatican released a written text on his behalf. The Pope said he was continuing his hospital treatment and resting. He thanked doctors and people around the world for their good wishes and asked them to pray for him. It's thought the message was written before his health took a significant downturn on Saturday. Faith is never lost, but it feels like optimism is fading.
What the Vatican is saying is that we are living the last days of Pope Francis. It's a bad news, it's a very sad news, but the medical conditions are getting worse.
Beneath a white altar 2 weeks ago, the Pope was seen struggling to breathe, unable to finish Sunday prayers. Past that same, now empty structure, deacons filed into St. Peter's Basilica for a Jubilee event. It was supposed to have been led by the Pope. Instead, there were prayers for his survival.
Papa Francesco, benché in un letto dell'ospedale.
The organiser of special events for the Church's Holy Year saying they could feel the presence of Pope Francis amongst them. People had come from around the world to attend the Mass, including 2 deacons from Birmingham who, as we filmed, were asked to deliver a blessing to a passerby. They were philosophical. They didn't get to see the Pope.
He's a great man. We all love him to bits.
How difficult was it coming here today knowing the Pope's critically ill?
Well, we just trust in the Lord and see where it goes. I mean, it is what it is. We can't change that.
There's a slight disappointment because we always want to see him in person, but he was there. He was there. I'm sure he was following it. It were his words that were read in the homily. So he was with us, as we say in spirit. As you can feel that, you do something and a member of your family can't be there, but they're thinking about you at the same time, and he was there with us.
Out of sight, but on the minds of the faithful, hoping the Pope will return to the Vatican to lead their prayers. Lisa Holland, Sky News, Vatican City.
And this is the live scene outside St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican. We will give you an update on the Pope's health in about an hour's time, but that's the live scene there, obviously. Very quiet, local time, coming up to 7:15. Now, campaigners for women who lost out after an increase in the state pension age have threatened the government with legal action. Let's get more on this. We're joined in the studio by Sadia, who's been looking into this story. And Sadia, just remind viewers of this story, because it's been in and out of the press for a while now, hasn't it?
Yeah, so more than 3.5 million women who were born in the 1950s were affected when the government made a change to the state pension age to bring it in line with men. This was done in the 1990s. Now, these women say they weren't informed on time of the change, and that meant that they couldn't make retirement plans properly, and so they've long been campaigning for compensation. Now they're saying that they've been essentially gaslit by the government, saying that they had hoped that when the Labour Party came into power, that they would be supported, because this is what we saw during the election, in the election run-up. We saw those pictures of, key figures in the now government, people who are now the Work and Pension Secretary, yeah. Liz Kendall, Rachel Reeves, who's now the Chancellor, Angela Rayner, even the Prime Minister, sometimes photographed with the women, pledging their support. And since they've come into power, they've made payments out to the victims of the infected blood scandal, the post office scandal, for example. But when it comes to the WASPI women, the government have instead apologised, saying that the taxpayer simply can't justify spending what would be a £10.5 billion compensation package, saying that because by 2006, almost all of the women were aware of the change. So now the women are threatening legal action. They've sent a letter before action to the government, which is essentially a formal mechanism which gives them a chance to respond before this goes before a High Court judge. They've launched a £75,000 crowd justice campaign to fund their legal action, and the government has 2 weeks to respond.
OK, Sadia, for now, thank you so much for that update. We'll move over to the Middle East now. With a fragile ceasefire holding in Gaza, an ongoing military operation across the West Bank is causing unprecedented levels of destruction and displacement of Palestinians. Shortly after the start of the Gaza ceasefire, the Israeli military launched a major operation, demolishing homes in refugee camps and leaving neighbourhoods in ruins. Then, just this weekend, Israeli tanks moved into the West Bank for the first time in decades. Sky's international correspondent Diana Magnay travelled to Tulkarm and spoke to families caught up in the violence. And just a warning that this report contains distressing images and a moment a Palestinian boy is shot who then later died in hospital.
A bulldozer in the Tulkarm refugee camp demolishes homes in emptied-out Palestinian neighbourhoods. It's part of Operation Iron Wall, an Israeli military offensive targeting the northern West Bank with airstrikes, house demolitions and door-to-door raids, launched 2 days after the Gaza ceasefire was agreed.
And the Israeli soldiers did this?
Zainab Qasim shows us how Israeli troops ransacked her neighbour's apartment, ripping through their possessions and firing into walls, holding her children at gunpoint.
I have a daughter with special needs. She couldn't understand what was happening or what it means when a weapon is pointed at her head.
I was so scared. I even started crying. I was worried about my brother. They were so aggressive. They were screaming so much.
The family have had to evacuate 3 times since the operation began.
This has become a mini Gaza. If I showed you the streets just behind that door, you would say this is Gaza.
It's not on the scale of Gaza, but critics say the operation is a compensation of sorts to the extremist right wing who didn't want the Gaza war to end and who are holding up Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition. And it has already displaced 40,000 people.
Israel says this is about rooting out militant groups to make sure that another October the 7th doesn't originate from the West Bank. But if you look at the destruction, the fact that they've bombed homes, destroyed the infrastructure, taken out the water systems, the electricity, it looks very much like the ultimate aim is to make it impossible for Palestinians to return.
10-year-old Saddam Rajab was shot 1 week into the operation when he was on the phone to his mother. In CCTV footage, the child screams in pain and struggles to move. His father, who is on crutches, finally reaches him 2 long minutes later.
We called an ambulance. It came and carried my boy. I tried to join him, and before I knew it, 20 to 30 Israeli soldiers turned up. Where they came from, I have no idea. They detained us for almost an hour.
In 2 separate journeys, the ambulances carrying Saddam to hospitals were stopped and searched by the Israeli Defense Forces, critical time that was lost. He never regained consciousness and died in hospital 2 weeks later. The IDF say they are investigating Saddam's case.
Let's assume their claims that they are fighting armed terrorists. How is a 10-year-old boy an armed terrorist? When his younger sister asks me daily, where is Saddam? I have to make excuses. When my youngest children grow up and learn the details, they'll be filled with resentment.
This conflict continues to claim innocent lives, each tragic case pushing the prospect of peaceful coexistence that bit further away. Donald Trump has said he'll be making a decision on the West Bank in the coming weeks. That is unlikely to account for the millions of Palestinians who call it their home. Diana Magnay, Sky News, Tulkarm in the West Bank.
Still to come on The Breakfast Show for you, how do the Russian people view the country's so-called special operation 3 years on? Plus, we look at a new guide created to help the parents of LGBT+ children tackle homophobia in schools. And at 2:45, we'll discuss the stories making today's papers in our news review with Mari.
We're trying to see as much as we can.
We start with breaking news. Historic day here today.
The golden age of America begins right now.
A long-awaited ceasefire is now underway.
First question, Sky News.
This is a huge moment. It's incredible.
Now to California.
Do you owe citizens an apology? Have you nothing to say?
Jane Secker, Sky News. Would you like to respond to us now?
Beth Rigby, Sky News.
In principle, would you agree to do that?
Criticism of you is banned. How is this a fair election?
The cameras are poised, waiting to see what the president might do next.
Thank you. Thank you all.
We arrive. A secret hospital hidden in the Myanmar jungle, treating the victims of this bloody war.
This is Myanmar today. Its military rulers don't want the world to see, but we have.
I fight for my own future. I fight for my generation's futures.
This is an actual crime.
They don't care for that.
Myanmar army is only a couple of kilometers away.
So this is a major humanitarian disaster.
Paris reverberated to the sights, sounds and smells of conflict.
There's a focal point to all this anger, and that is Emmanuel Macron.
I'm Adam Parsons, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Brussels.
There are dozens of people desperately clambering to get onto that boat. It is a chaotic scene, but it's being watched by dozens of French police officers on the beach.
I've reported on migration across Europe, close up on the ground, understanding that sense of desperation and meeting the criminal gangs behind it.
This old fishing boat set off from the Libyan port of Tobruk. There were 606 people who were on board. So we've been distributing life jackets to all the people on board this boat, and now the first person is coming on board. This is the ugly side of Italian football. In Italy, everything is really organized. Football's problems with hooliganism, racism were just dormant, and now they're back and they're getting worse.
We cover so many countries, languages and cultures and work hard to gain trust to bring you the full story first.
Help is slowly reaching these places.
It's not just homes, but whole streets like this one that have been reduced to rubble and dust.
This is a picture of destruction.
Everywhere you look in this mountaintop community, there is absolute devastation.
These are the settlers in waiting, keen to start a new life, to annex Gaza for Israel.
The least we can do is just kick them out of our land.
Gaza, which is just 2 miles in that direction, is under attack again. Getting the chance to tell people's stories, it's a privilege.
World leaders will gather in Kyiv today on the 3rd anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's a meeting in which President Zelenskyy hopes to cover security guarantees for his country as the United States continues to make moves towards a peace deal with Russia. President Trump's recent actions seem to have given Moscow renewed confidence in their so-called special operation. But some Russian families who lost loved ones say they've paid a heavy price for the 3-year war. Our Moscow correspondent, Ivor Bennett, reports.
Around Moscow, you see the word victory. Victory will be ours, this sign reads. But do peace talks still count as a win? The Kremlin's war in Ukraine wasn't supposed to last this long. 3 years that have seen Russia itself invaded. But the mood in Moscow is triumphant. Relations with the US are thawing and currents shifting in Russia's favor. Nothing will feel like a victory for Yelena, though, no matter how the war ends. Her 18-year-old son, Valentin, was killed in Russia's Kursk region in September, soon after Ukraine's incursion there.
Sometimes I sit and think who my grandchildren could have been. It's impossible to live like this. It's very hard for me to be without him. I still wait for him to come back home every day, even though I saw his body. I still can't believe it. I want all mothers to see their children come home.
Yelena made this video in memory of Valentin, who she says was excited to do his military service. The Kremlin promised conscripts wouldn't be involved in combat, but after being sent to the border, the war came to him.
It should be specially trained people there, not children. They were taken from home, from a mother's nest, and brought to some unknown place where there is shooting. What kind of warrior is he? He's not a warrior.
She even wrote to Vladimir Putin, asking for an explanation, but no reply. All she has instead is a grave and her grief. Russia doesn't publish its casualty figures, and it's only when you come to a place like this that you get a sense of the scale of the losses. The military graves are the ones marked out by flags, and there are dozens and dozens of them. And this is just one cemetery in one town in one region. Back in Moscow, honours for those who do return, and an unwavering belief that Russia won't be defeated.
The victory will be significant. The main thing is for this to end quickly. But in any case, we will make every effort to ensure that victory is still ours. No one will take it away from us.
Vladimir Putin appears increasingly confident too. On Defender of the Fatherland Day, a focus on Russia's losses, but it seems gains are now within reach. Ivor Bennett, Sky News, Moscow.
Well, let's take a first look at this morning's front pages for you then. And let's start with the Financial Times. The German election and the rise of the far right is leading many of the papers this morning, including that front page there of the Financial Times. Meanwhile, the Times, too, goes with the German election, saying the right-wing AfD party swept up millions of young and working-class voters. And this is the Guardian. Conservatives set to lead German coalition as far-right party surges, they're reporting. Meanwhile, on the front page of The Telegraph, Volodymyr Zelensky's statement that he'd willingly quit as president of Ukraine if that was the price of peace. And the Mirror has high praise for Zelensky's offer, saying it puts Donald Trump's attitude to shame. Meanwhile, the Eye reports that Labour's plan to build 1.5 million new homes is under threat, and this is because of a shortage of skilled builders. Meanwhile, the Express has a story on the WASPy women, we were reporting this earlier, who are threatening to sue the government if they're not compensated. Meanwhile, the Mail reports that Conservative leader Kemi Badenoch has written to the boss of the BBC. This is over claims that TV licence money found its way to the militant group Hamas. The Sun claims an exclusive with a report that more than 80 deaths in the UK have been linked to people taking weight loss drugs. And the Star says that scientists who've been developing AI technology are now losing their jobs to the very thing they've created. There you go. Those are the front pages for you, of course. We'll delve deeper into today's papers in our news review with Maury. That's at 6:45. Now, some of Hollywood's biggest names have turned out for the Screen Actors Guild Awards, or the SAGs, the final step on the road to the Oscars. So let's take you through some of the big winners then. Conclave took home the night's top honour for Best Ensemble in a Motion Picture. The film focuses on the Vatican as it tries to nominate a pope. Very timely film at the moment. The cast took a moment while on stage to wish Pope Francis a quick recovery. Elsewhere, there was surprise in the Outstanding Male Actor category. Looks very happy, doesn't he? Timothée Chalamet winning for his portrayal of Bob Dylan in A Complete Unknown, beating favourite Adrian Brody, who stars in The Brutalist. Meanwhile, Demi Moore took home prize for Outstanding Female Actor for her performance in The Substance, a horror film. This is about the objectification of the human body. And then, in the TV categories, Shogun won 3 honours, including Best Ensemble in a drama series for its historical depiction of Imperial Japan. Well, still to come on The Breakfast Show this Monday. Tackling a rise of homophobia in schools, we're going to talk to an author of a new guide to help parents. And then in sport, France revived their Six Nations title hopes as they ran in 11 tries against Italy to record the second highest points total in the competition's history.
We arrive. A secret hospital hidden in the Myanmar jungle, treating the victims of this bloody war.
This is Myanmar today. Its military rulers don't want the world to see, but we have.
I fight for my own future. I fight for my generation's futures.
This is an actual crime.
They don't care for that.
Myanmar army is only a couple of kilometers away. So this is a major humanitarian disaster.
Paris reverberated to the sights, sounds and smells of conflict. There's a focal point to all this anger, and that is Emmanuel Macron. I'm Adam Parsons, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Brussels. There are dozens of people desperately clambering to get onto that boat. It is a chaotic scene, but it's being watched by dozens of French police officers on the beach. I've reported on migration across Europe, close up on the ground, understanding that sense of desperation and meeting the criminal gangs behind it. This old fishing boat set off from the Libyan port of Tobruk. There were 606 people who were on board. So we've been distributing life jackets to all the people on board this boat, and now the first person is coming on board. This is the ugly side of Italian football. In Italy, everything is really organized. Football's problems with hooliganism, racism were just dormant, and now they're back and they're getting worse. We cover so many countries, languages and cultures and work hard to gain trust to bring you the full story first. Help is slowly reaching these places. It's not just homes, but whole streets like this one that have been reduced to rubble and dust. This is a picture of destruction. Everywhere you look in this mountaintop community, there is absolute devastation. These are the settlers in waiting, keen to start a new life, to annex Gaza for Israel.
The least we can do is just kick them out of our land.
Gaza, which is just 2 miles in that direction, is under attack again. Getting the chance to tell people's stories, it's a privilege.
Welcome back to The Breakfast Show. Coming up, we'll take a look through today's papers in our news review and we'll bring you all of yesterday's sporting action. But first, let's take a look at today's top stories for you. Just a quick reminder, Germany's Conservative Party have come first in a national election and must now form a coalition. Voters wait to see if it will break with convention and invite the far right into government. The AfD came second and welcomed that prospect.
Our hand will always remain outstretched for participation in government, to implement the will of the people, the will of Germany. We are ready to participate in government.
On the anniversary of Putin's war in Ukraine, the UK introduces a new raft of sanctions targeting the country's billionaire oligarchs. We report on the toll the war is taking on a generation of young Russian men.
The military graves are the ones marked out by flags, and there are dozens and dozens of them. And this is just one cemetery in one town in one region.
These are live pictures of the Vatican as the Pope remains in hospital in a critical condition. The latest update said he's now developed a kidney problem. We are expecting more information on the state of his health this morning. Palestinian militant group Hamas has said it won't engage in any further ceasefire talks with Israel until prisoners are freed as part of a current deal. Israel delayed the release of more than 600 Palestinian prisoners and claiming Hamas had breached the terms of its agreement. And a campaign group is threatening the government with legal action unless it reconsiders its rejection of compensation for millions of women who were impacted by the changes to the state pension age. The Prime Minister says any deal for WASPy women would cost taxpayers over £10 billion. And the cast of Conclave, a film about selecting a new pope, have won the top prize at the Screen Actors Guild Award. Just a week out from the Oscars, there was also a surprise in Best Actor category with Timothée Chalamet's portrayal of Bob Dylan in A Complete Unknown, beating out Adrian Brody in The Brutalist. Those are your headlines now. A new guide has been released to help parents of LGBT plus children to become better allies. It's in response to an apparent resurgence of homophobia in primary schools. Incredible story, this. Let's get more on this with Laura Mackay, Chief Executive Officer of the LGBT plus young people's charity, Just Like Us, who created the guide. Great to have you with us. Very good morning to you. So what's going on? A rise in homophobia in primary schools?
Good morning. Yes, our research has showed that an increase in primary and secondary schools, where 78% of primary school young people and 80% of secondary school have heard homophobic language. And you know, this creates shame, it creates a really toxic environment for young people in schools. Yet a third of British parents have never spoken to their child about what being LGBT plus means, or about the community. So we just want to put this guide out to really support parents and young people in secondary and primary education.
So Laura, tell us a bit about the guide then, the nuts and bolts of it. What can parents expect?
It was put together in consultation with over 100 LGBT plus people and their parents. And it was clear from our research that people really wanted this guide. LGBT plus young adults are twice as likely to report not being close to their families compared to non-LGBT plus young people. And almost half are estranged from one family member. So it's really going to support people to have that family acceptance, have the voice, have the tools to be able to talk to young people about the LGBT plus community and support that allyship. This guide is for all parents of all children because it's really important that young people are able to move through the world without shame. Where there is silence, there is shame. And we know that parents really want their young people to grow up, their children to grow up in a loving and caring environment, and that this is just giving them that voice to be able to tackle issues that maybe they didn't feel that they could.
Yeah, you make such an interesting point there, Laura, because I've got a 7-year-old at home who's about to head back to school after half term. And what you want to create is a loving, open environment where they feel that they can come and talk to you about anything. But in particular with this, you just want them to feel happy, don't you, with whoever they decide is someone that they want to be with in the future. But for parents who aren't like that, I suppose, what's been the reaction from the guide that you've had so far?
To be honest, the reaction from the guide has been overwhelmingly positive. We're a small team, and actually, it's quite a lot to cope with. We've had, incredible endorsement from celebrities like Jonathan Bailey, Jessie Ware, Sandy Toksvig, and I think people just realise that this guide is important to everybody, whether or not your child identifies as LGBT plus or will in the future, because creating an environment that's inclusive at home allows all young people, as you say, to be themselves. The guide is out today, and we can't wait for parents to start using it, to engage with it. And honestly, yeah, we've had a tremendously positive reaction, and we hope that that continues.
Laura, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for creating this guide, and best of luck with it moving forward too.
Thank you so much.
OK, let's take a look at your sport.
Staying connected is vital for business. Sky Business sponsors this report.
you got more chance of winning the lottery than making it as a professional footballer.
Players now, they have much more responsibility.
I've heard all the stories, anecdotes from old friends.
I think your responsibility is to guide them in the same direction as I went myself.
The route to the very top.
Everyone would like to be a footballer, but there's only a certain few of us that are lucky enough to go and be that.
Young people devastated once they've been released.
I'm forever searching for Matthew.
I've seen how the academies work.
Success is reaching your full potential.
From different areas of the pyramid.
Thank you to everyone at Exeter for all you've done for me.
It's clear this country is producing good players. But are we giving them the whole package? I want to help. I decided to get some more advice on education. This is Bryanston School in Dorset. Richard Jones is the headmaster here and has some big ideas that could work in football. Even Premier League clubs visit here, looking at the work they do around mentoring pupils.
Our approach here at Bryanston is that we have a one-to-one tutor approach. So when a pupil joins Bryanston, we take the time to understand them better before they actually begin with us. And then once we know what they're like as a character, what their interests are, what their passions are, what their background is, then we allocate them a member of staff that we think they're going to form a really good connection and relationship with. So that member of staff then stays with them as their tutor for their hopefully their whole 5-year period that they're with us.
How much do you think the kids lose touch with other parts of their life as youngsters?
Sky Business sponsors this report.
Still to come on The Breakfast Show. Stay with us. We'll be discussing the stories making today's papers with our political correspondent, Mara Aurora.
We arrive. A secret hospital hidden in the Myanmar jungle, treating the victims of this bloody war.
This is Myanmar today. Its military rulers don't want the world to see, but we have.
I fight for my own future. I fight for my generation's futures.
This is an actual crime.
They don't care for that.
Myanmar army is only a couple of kilometers away. So this is a major humanitarian disaster.
Paris reverberated to the sights, sounds and smells of conflict. There's a focal point to all this anger, and that is Emmanuel Macron.
I'm Adam Parsons, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Brussels.
There are dozens of people desperately clambering to get onto that boat. It is a chaotic scene, but it's being watched by dozens of French police officers on the beach.
I've reported on migration across Europe, close up on the ground, understanding that sense of desperation and meeting the criminal gangs behind it.
This old fishing boat set off from the Libyan port of Tobruk. There were 606 people who were on board.
So we've been distributing life jackets to all the people on board this boat, and now the first person is coming on board.
This is the ugly side of Italian football. In Italy, everything is really organized. Football's problems with hooliganism, racism were just dormant, and now they're back and they're getting worse.
We cover so many countries, languages and cultures and work hard to gain trust to bring you the full story first.
Help is slowly reaching these places.
It's not just homes, but whole streets like this one that have been reduced to rubble and dust.
This is a picture of destruction.
Everywhere you look in this mountaintop community, there is absolute devastation.
These are the settlers in waiting, keen to start a new life, to annex Gaza for Israel.
The least we can do is just kick them out of our land.
Gaza, which is just 2 miles in that direction, is under attack again. Getting the chance to tell people's stories, it's a privilege.
I saw police being forceful, pushing young men and women to the ground as they made almost 100 arrests. Will the cold affect your voters?
Well, we have a lot of tremendous support.
Free, wherever you get your news.
the people here know that worse storms may well be on their way. I'm Martha Kellner, and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Hello, welcome back, everybody. Our news review very shortly, but first let's go through what Wilfred Frost has coming up. From 7 o'clock, another bumper show. At 7:15, he'll be speaking to the Security Minister, Dan Jarvis. This is as the government introduces new sanctions banning elites linked to Russia from entering the UK. Elsewhere, at 7:30, reaction, of course, to Germany's election with the country's ambassador to the UK, that's Miguel Berger. And then at 9:30, we'll be joined by Olga Ivazovsky. She's the chair of Ukraine's leading election watchdog, and she'll be reacting to those comments by Donald Trump, calling President Zelenskyy a dictator, amongst other things. Wow, pleased to say, great to be back with you, Mari, on the news review.
Absolutely.
Shall we kick off with the Daily Mirror? This spread, page 4 and 5, really remarkable speech, I thought, from President Zelenskyy, stating, and it's that big headline, isn't it, "I'll quit for peace," which is extraordinary. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so I wanted to pick the Mirror because they have got a very specific take on this.
Yes.
You can see that double-page spread, but also the headline on their actual front-page splash is, "Now that's a leader." And what they are trying to do in the coverage you're seeing on your screen at the moment is they're trying to bring in a direct comparison between Zelenskyy and Donald Trump. And what they're saying, that literally the second line in the paragraph is, "In a move that shames Donald Trump's childish, petty leadership." They are trying to show that President Zelenskyy is being mature, is being humble, is putting his country first rather than his own political ambitions or his pride or anything else. And they are trying to say that actually Donald Trump almost needs to take a leaf out of Zelenskyy's book in terms of his kind of statesmanship attitude. And as you say, that quote there, "If to achieve peace you really need me to give up my post, I'm ready." Zelenskyy really trying to say it's not about me, it's about Ukraine. And actually, really interestingly as well, there's a quote where he says, someone was asked about his comments from Donald Trump calling him a dictator. Yes. And he says, "I wasn't offended, but a dictator would be." So he's really just trying to be the bigger man almost, and not try and stoop to cheap insults or kind of tit for tat over the broadcast waves, as it were, but really trying to say, hey, I am a serious leader and you can take me seriously. I'm not going to be upset or kind of angered by particular comments. It's water off a duck's back, and the priority is the country. And they are also talking about how Mr. Trump was accused of behaving like a mafia boss, carrying out an extortion racket. That was in relation to his demands around 50% of the rare earth minerals and the profits from that in Ukraine. So they've got a quote here from a Democrat. Obviously, they're a Democrat, so they would say this, but nonetheless, Jim Himes, a Democrat, says, "It just looks like an episode of The Sopranos. Give us your minerals or we're not going to help you fight a bloody butcher. I mean, is this really what we want the greatest country in history to be known for? Some mafia thing." So clearly, Democrat circles feel that Donald Trump's way of kind of grandstanding on the world stage is not reflecting well on the US. Of course, Donald Trump and his allies would say the absolute opposite, and it's America first, and they're doing what's best for the nation. But you can see how this is kind of tearing public opinion apart in terms of how many people are rallying behind Zelenskyy in reaction to Donald Trump's words and remarks, really.
Yeah, well, two people who are rallying behind Volodymyr Zelenskyy are Sir Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, who are heading to Washington this week for talks to see whether they'll be able to persuade Donald Trump to think a little bit differently. But then linked to that is a story in the Financial Times today. We've been talking about it a lot on the show, and this is how Russian elites are being banned from Britain in order to really tighten perhaps that grip on Russia, and then conversations around, obviously, defence spending from this government too, from 2.3% to see whether it will go to 2.5%, and Europe really taking a lead on their defence of Ukraine and talking out against Vladimir Putin, because we saw, didn't we, Mari, a few days ago, the speech from Sir Keir Starmer, him really kind of defending Ukraine. And so these sanctions will go perhaps a long way in really highlighting where the UK position is.
Yeah, I mean, I think the government will hope these sanctions are indicative of its position, of its solidarity with Ukraine, of its unwavering condemnation of the Russians. Nonetheless, you know, how much more are these sanctions really going to have an impact? If they were potentially incredibly impactful, one would argue, why haven't they done them sooner? But nonetheless, if nothing else, it is symbolic of exactly where they stand and where the UK government stands when it comes to this war and this illegal invasion of Ukraine, especially, as we've pointed out, on a day that is the 3-year anniversary of that invasion.
Yeah, and obviously, talking of where Europe stands, Germany's been a really interesting country, hasn't it, in positioning with how it stands on Ukraine in those early days, sending helmets to Ukraine. And the front page of The Guardian today is all about reflecting, and many of the papers really, on that German election, and The Guardian going with Conservatives set to lead the coalition as far-right party surges. So the AfD in second, and this will all be about what the winning party does and who they want to work with moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, first of all, you know, the headline almost is the AfD doing well, but actually the headline is the fact that the CDU, the Conservative Democrats in Germany, have won the largest section of the vote. That is indicative of the fact that Olaf Scholz and his party have not done enough to persuade people that their lives would get better, that things that the German economy was on a positive trajectory. The German economy is, you know, really kind of flailing at the moment, and clearly the public are concerned and don't believe Olaf Scholz. They haven't believed what he has been saying and what he has been promising, and clearly they've decided to go for Friedrich Merz instead. So they're about 30%, just under, it looks like, of the vote. Not enough, obviously, to win outright, but obviously that's a German system. It's a different system in the first place. But the AfD, as you say, about 20% of the vote. That's their best ever result in a German election. They focus on immigration, crime and high energy costs.
Yeah. And
some would
argue the big key issues for many Germans who are saying, look, my rent is too high. I can't afford that shop in the supermarket. And so their key themes feed into what people want to hear, potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you know, to an extent you can see something similar with the focus of the Reform Party here in the UK. They've also wanted to focus on immigration, crime, cost of living. And so I think, you know, a lot of political leaders here in the UK will be looking at this German election and thinking to themselves, my goodness, if we don't pull up our socks, if we don't really start to deliver and show people that we are delivering and make sure
people that they're listening, I think is a key thing for voters, isn't it? Because a lot of people feel like nobody's listening, we don't have a voice. And then you have a party like Reform or the AfD saying, look, we've got your back. We've got all of these issues and we're going to represent you. And that's going to be key in the coming years, I think.
It absolutely
is. The political scene here too.
If you saw the letter that Keir Starmer wrote to his cabinet ministers over the weekend, it was a long letter and a lot of it was about how a lot of the kind of liberal left had abandoned a lot of voters, were kind of looking down at voters, almost kind of, you know, a bit too much paternalism. We know what's best for you, you don't know what's best for you, and focusing actually back on what working people need and want, and he actually talked about immigration as part of that. So you can see that Keir Starmer is really alive to this threat, and he's clearly wanting to make sure that he nips the reform threat in the bud rather than allowing something like this to happen in a few years' time, where we could see this kind of replicating in the UK. The question will be, is it possible to stem that tide? And in Germany, just as a side note, the mainstream parties have pledged once again to maintain that firewall, so nobody will cooperate with them as well.
That's what's going to be key. You create that firewall, people will start to think, actually, no one's listening to us in Parliament, no one's listening to us in government, and that's going to be an issue, I think, that will play out. Do you fancy a bit of light relief?
Go on.
What do you do to quail off any anxiety? What's your go-to to feel less stressed?
Yoga.
Yoga, OK. Well, in the Times, apparently, lots of young people are casting off their anxiety by fishing. It's a new thing. According to the Angling Trust, thousands of young people have been awarded rod licences in the last year. That calming effect of sitting by a lake or a river, nothing but the birds and the trees swaying in the wind, and sitting there focusing on something so peaceful has really taken off. It's across Instagram. If you search fishing in Instagram, lots of accounts with influencers in the fishing community that are under the age of 40, which is incredible. And, you know, a serious point on this, the chief executive of the Trust, which runs a community of around 2,500 members, said since lockdown, lots of young people have rediscovered the value of being outside and wanting to reconnect with something that isn't, you know, television or isn't scrolling, that doom scroll of social media. So they're kind of showing that the benefits of well-being and reducing stress could be fishing.
Why not? I think this is a fantastic idea. Being outdoors is so, so good for you, and it can't get enough.
Well, stay indoors, because we have the next big bumper edition of Breakfast with Wilfred Frost after the break.
Mandatory evacuation, you must leave!
For many people, Harvey is far from over.
People here believe the water will be this deep for weeks.
I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's chief North of England correspondent.
Are you trying to run me over, Sir Philip?
No, go away.
Look like it, sir. Will you respond to those who made accusations, Sir Philip?
Can you go away? Sky News, the full story first.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. I'm ready. Are you? Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Good morning. It's 7 o'clock. Germany's far right surges into second place.
Plus, back here, number 10 hopes another round of Russia sanctions will help Ukraine.
And we'll speak to the German ambassador about both this hour.
It's Monday, the 24th of February. Your headlines. Germany's Conservatives celebrate success while the country's far right doubles its vote share. The Pope remains in a critical condition, now developing a kidney problem. We'll get an update shortly. Leaders begin arriving in Kiev for a summit on the third anniversary of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And Conclave takes the top prize at last night's SAG Awards. Next stop, the Oscars. We'll tell you why there's all to play for. A very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us here on Sky News Breakfast. Well, the stage is set for coalition building in Germany after yesterday's election. The country's Conservatives came out on top with almost 30% of the vote, but the story of the night was the surge in support for the far right, placing them in second position. The question now is whether the established parties will continue the long-held convention of a firewall, blocking the AfD from joining a coalition. Well, let's get an update now from our Europe correspondent, Adam Parsons, who's in Berlin for us this morning. Adam, good morning to you. The story of the night, if you snapshot backwards very clearly, a huge surge for the AfD. As we approached election day in the short term, were there some thoughts that they might do even better still? And ultimately, what does this all mean as to who will be Germany's next chancellor?
Well, to answer those in order, yeah, the AfD, I think, did think that they would do even better. They hoped to get to 22, 23%. They've been polling at that not long before the election. But clearly, the fact that they have doubled their vote share up to around 20% is a huge moment in German politics. This is a genuinely far-right party. Very unlikely to have anything to do with government because there is this long-established firewall where the established political parties want nothing to do with the AfD. And I think it is worth always remembering that while 20% of German voters have gone for the AfD, 80% have not. And of that 80%, there is a huge rump of German voters who really don't like the AfD, think they are divisive, too radical, racist, whatever. Hence, you've seen a lot of protests against them. And yet, nevertheless, this was, for them, a very significant inflection point and one that was celebrated by their leader, Alice Weidel.
We have doubled our votes. They wanted to cut them in half. The opposite has happened. And I must say one thing. Our hand will always remain outstretched for participation in government, to implement the will of the people, the will of Germany. We are ready to participate in government.
So when she talks about a black-blue coalition, what she means is that she is prepared to go into coalition with the CDU, CSU, the Christian Democrats, the people who won this election, led by Friedrich Merz. That is not going to happen. He will not go into coalition with the AfD. The question is, who will he go into coalition with? And that is going to be the focus of attention when we get to these negotiations in the coming days and weeks, when they look at the actual number of seats for each party. The obvious partner would be the Social Democrats, the party of Olaf Scholz, the previous Chancellor, and maybe the Greens alongside. But already notably, by the way, Friedrich Merz has condemned American electoral interference and says Germany and Europe need to move further away from the United States. This is a volatile but engrossing political situation.
Can I just ask quickly, Adam, how long will this all take? I mean, obviously there's a power vacuum today. Will the new government be in place in days, weeks, months?
Probably days or weeks. Months would be unlikely, but days and weeks would not be surprising. That's what happened last time, and that took many weeks because that was a complicated coalition in the end. So, yeah, the answer is it can take a long time, and the horse trading about who gets what, especially when you have the smaller parties, and yet they still want their platform. So just to take one example, if you did bring the Greens in, clearly they want very different things from some of the more right-wing members of the CDU. It is never straightforward.
Adam Parsons, thanks so much. Live for us in Berlin. So much more to come on that story throughout the morning, including at 7:30. We'll be joined by the German ambassador to the UK. Now, we're expecting an update on the Pope's health shortly. The Vatican says he remains in a critical condition, having also now developed a kidney problem. Lisa Holland has the latest for us from Rome this morning. Lisa is in Vatican City, in fact. Lisa, what is the latest? Everyone is on tenterhooks.
Yes, well, we've been getting these medical updates 3 times a day since last Tuesday, when the Vatican announced that Pope Francis had been taken into hospital and that he had developed double pneumonia. So quite frequent health updates from the Vatican. One is expected within the next half an hour or so. Over the course of recent days, that early morning bulletin has simply acknowledged that the Pope has had a good night, although really reading between the lines, in the earlier days of last week, they were saying that he had had breakfast, that he got out of bed, and those words were really diminishing to the point over the weekend where they were simply saying that he'd had a restful night. So that's what was being said. And then, of course, on Saturday, there was a significant downturn when the Vatican announced that his condition had deteriorated to the point that they were describing it as critical. Yesterday was something of a more stable day in the sense that there was no other prolonged respiratory crisis. Those were the words that the Vatican used on Saturday when the Pope had required intervention for high-flow oxygen, and he had also needed several blood transfusions. But yesterday, I think the medical announcement that he had early signs of kidney failure was also seen as very worrying. In short, that there has been some level of deterioration every day since he was taken into hospital.
Lisa, thanks so much for that update. And we're going to be back out with Lisa, of course, throughout the day, as and when there are any further updates on the Pope's health. Now time for all of those other stories. I'm delighted that Leah is back. Where have you been, Leah?
I know we need to talk about this.
Been too busy elsewhere.
Too busy, but always when I got that call to say Wilfred needs a bulletin host, I was like, I'm there with bells on.
Way more than that. Leah, great to have you back.
Thank you so much, Wilfred. Listen, we're going to head to the Middle East this morning. Bit of an update there. A Palestinian militant group, Hamas, says it won't hold further talks with Israel on the next phase of the ceasefire agreement until prisoners who were due to be freed on Saturday are let go. Israel said it delayed the release of more than 600 Palestinian prisoners as it wanted guarantees from Hamas that more hostages will be freed without what they called humiliating ceremonies. Meanwhile, the White House has backed Israel's decision, saying it's an appropriate response to Hamas's treatment of hostages. A body has been found in the search for missing runner Jenny Hall. The 23-year-old was last seen on Tuesday leaving her home in Barracks Farm, County Durham. Officers say the body was found in a remote area of Teesdale and don't believe there are any suspicious circumstances. A British couple in their 70s have reportedly been arrested by the Taliban in Afghanistan. Peter and Barbie Reynolds, who you see on screen, have run education programmes in the country for 18 years. Their children say they were detained earlier this month, but the reason for their arrest is unknown. Pharmacists are warning patients that services may be reduced or cut off entirely unless the government provides more funding. The National Pharmacy Association says issues like the national insurance rise will mean pharmacies in England will face £250 million of unplanned costs come April. And the number of homes in Britain valued at £1 million or more has risen by around 30% over the past 5 years. This is according to property firm Savills. One of every 42 homes in Britain is valued at £1 million plus. And that rises, of course, in London to 1 in 11 homes. And in the capital, recording the biggest increase of £1 million homes.
Wow, 1 in 11
I know.
in the capital. That is a striking statistic.
Stark.
Yeah, great stuff. Thank you. Now today, on the anniversary of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, Number 10 sets out a fresh round of sanctions, this time targeting the country's billionaire oligarchs. More on that in just a moment with Mari. But first, let's tell you about a summit that President Zelenskyy is holding in Kiev today. Deborah Haynes joins us live from Kiev with that. And Deborah, very good morning to you. What is the significance of this particular gathering? Of course, it comes bang in the middle of a gathering in Paris last week and various bilats in Washington in the week ahead.
Well, this day is hugely significant to this country. It was exactly 3 years ago to the day that Russia launched its full-scale war on Ukraine. And I was here in the capital along with other Sky colleagues, and we had the air raid sirens sounding for the first time as Russian missiles rained down on this city. Russian troops, more than 200,000 of them, poured across the border from the north in Belarus into the north of Ukraine, and then all along Ukraine's eastern border, trying to capture Kyiv. They failed in the end, but the fighting is still raging in the east, with Russian forces still trying to take land at huge cost to the Russian side, but devastating as well cost to Ukraine. And now, caught in the middle, Ukraine is having to deal with a new front line when it comes to the way that Donald Trump has decided to tackle the Ukraine war, seeing himself more as a mediator between two opposing sides, rather than the previous administration, which was firmly on the side of Ukraine. And so today we're going to have, there's about 17 or so leaders, senior ministers and officials that are coming here from across the world. I don't think any British ministers are going to be here, which is, maybe a question mark over that. But there's going to be, like, for example, the head of the EU Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. She's just arrived by train, being greeted by Ukrainian top officials. There's going to be, of course, meetings here, declarations of support for Ukraine. But there's also going to be a bit of a showdown at the United Nations, which has really alarmed and disappointed a lot of Europeans that I've been speaking to. Each year since Russia launched its full-scale war, Ukraine has proposed a resolution to the General Assembly that is condemning the war, condemning Russia's war, condemning the bloodshed caused by Russia, and calling for Russia to remove its troops. Now, that proposal is being submitted again today at the General Assembly. But just last week, the United States, normally a signatory to the Ukrainian proposal, pushed forward its own resolution, a much shorter wording, again calling for an end to the war, but apportioning no blame to this bloodshed, not mentioning how Russia was the cause of this aggression. There's been a lot of arm twisting going on behind the scenes, diplomatic arm twisting by both sides, trying to get, for example, people to support the US resolution, which would then maybe supersede the Ukrainian one. I asked the Ukrainian foreign minister about this yesterday, and he was very clear Ukraine is still going to be pushing forward with its resolution.
Deborah, as always, thanks so much. Deborah Haynes there for us in Kiev this morning. Well, Mari's here to discuss some of the developments from this side. Talk us through some of these announcements that we've seen this morning, Mari.
So this morning, the Home Office is announcing a kind of new raft of sanctions on Russian oligarchs, so those with close links to the Kremlin. And what they're saying is that they could potentially be excluded from entering the UK, and so they are expanding the criteria of those who they can exclude from entering the UK. So it's now going to include anyone who provides significant support to the Russian state, those who own their status to the Russian state or their wealth to the Russian state, and those who enjoy access to the highest levels of the Russian state. And the government is insisting that this is in the UK's national interests. They say that those individuals actually undermine national security here in the UK, and therefore they should be excluded, and they enable the continuation of Russian aggression in Ukraine. It's difficult. On one hand, this announcement could be massively welcomed as a way to put even more pressure on Russia as they, continue to bombard Ukraine. Others would argue, why wouldn't you have done this before? If it really is quite significant, why would you wait? And then also we are going to have a statement in the House of Commons from the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, on this later today. He talks about how it's there to essentially erode the military machine and reduce the revenue that is fueling the war. And then the Prime Minister has lots of other engagements today, like, for instance, a reception in Number 10 to mark the anniversary.
It's interesting as well, the timing, because financial sanctions are very hard to impose effectively at any time, but especially if the US is considering pulling back from doing the same. I mean, you really need the US behind them, and just imposing them from a UK or European perspective will still provide, I think, quite a lot of workarounds if the US does now start to water down its sanctions on the US. Just quickly as well, obviously, Keir Starmer's going to DC at some point this week, but did we know President Macron was going first?
So we were aware operationally, but now that it's been reported, we are allowed to report it and reveal it. So yes, Keir Starmer is now not going to be the first European leader to meet Donald Trump. That might be disappointing for some in Number 10.
You were. There we go.
And I think also, Macron going over there today is setting a tone. Let's see what Macron can achieve, potentially even just laying some of the ground ahead of Keir Starmer. I mean, Starmer's on a G7 call today, he's on a virtual Ukraine summit today, and then he's got that meeting in the US. And there's been lots of speculation about whether he might use a defence spending pledge promise commitment to try and sweeten that deal with Donald Trump.
To be honest, in a normal, relaxed time, the competition of being first probably would be more significant. At this moment in time, perhaps, you can watch what President Macron does or doesn't say and Donald Trump's reaction, and maybe it actually is a benefit going second. We shall see, but fascinating times ahead in the next couple of days. Mari, as always, thanks so much. Now, during that Kiev summit today, President Zelenskyy will hope to cover security guarantees for his country as the United States continues to make moves towards a peace deal with Russia. Well, President Trump's recent actions seem to have given Moscow renewed confidence in their so-called special operation. But some Russian families who have lost loved ones say they've paid a heavy price for the 3-year war. Our Moscow correspondent Ivor Bennett has this report.
Around Moscow, you see the word victory. Victory will be ours, this sign reads. But do peace talks still count as a win? The Kremlin's war in Ukraine wasn't supposed to last this long. 3 years that have seen Russia itself invaded. But the mood in Moscow is triumphant. Relations with the US are thawing and currents shifting in Russia's favor. Nothing will feel like a victory for Yelena, though, no matter how the war ends. Her 18-year-old son, Valentin, was killed in Russia's Kursk region in September, soon after Ukraine's incursion there.
Sometimes I sit and think who my grandchildren could have been. It's impossible to live like this. It's very hard for me to be without him. I still wait for him to come back home every day, even though I saw his body. I still can't believe it. I want all mothers to see their children come home.
Yelena made this video in memory of Valentin, who she says was excited to do his military service. The Kremlin promised conscripts wouldn't be involved in combat, but after being sent to the border, the war came to him.
It should be specially trained people there, not children. They were taken from home, from a mother's nest, and brought to some unknown place where there is shooting. What kind of warrior is he? He's not a warrior.
She even wrote to Vladimir Putin, asking for an explanation. But no reply. All she has instead is a grave and her grief.
Russia doesn't publish its casualty figures, and it's only when you come to a place like this that you get a sense of the scale of the losses. The military graves are the ones marked out by flags, and there are dozens and dozens of them. And this is just one cemetery in one town in one region.
Back in Moscow, honours for those who do return, and an unwavering belief that Russia won't be defeated.
The victory will be significant. The main thing is for this to end quickly. But in any case, we will make every effort to ensure that victory is still ours. No one will take it away from us.
Vladimir Putin appears increasingly confident too. On Defender of the Fatherland Day, a focus on Russia's losses, but it seems gains are now within reach. Ivor Bennett, Sky News, Moscow.
We've just had an update from the Vatican on the health of the Pope. A statement says he had a good night in hospital, slept and is resting. And we'll get more with Lisa Holland later on in the programme, who's in Rome for us this morning. But that update just coming from the Vatican. Let's get much more on all of the day's stories, particularly, of course, the anniversary of the Ukraine invasion with Security Minister Dan Jarvis, who's with me this morning. Good morning, Minister. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
Such an important trip to Washington, D.C. for the Prime Minister this week. Is he prepared to fall out with the President, if necessary, on a number of key issues, like the fact as to whether Zelenskyy is a dictator or not?
Well, I think we do have a special relationship with the United States. This is an important opportunity for the Prime Minister to meet with President Trump and to discuss a range of shared interests. Clearly, national security is a very important subject that will be discussed. We're 3 years on from Putin's illegal invasion in Ukraine, and clearly there will be conversations about the role of NATO and about the role that we can work together to bring the conflict to a conclusion. But clearly other things will be discussed as well, not least our shared economic security and the work that we want to do to improve our economies.
But I mean, he will, I guess, tell the President that he believes President Zelenskyy is not a dictator, for example.
President Zelenskyy was democratically elected, and I'm sure that the Prime Minister will have very good and constructive conversations with the President. We have shared interests in a range of different areas, not least in terms of our national security. We're 3 years on now from Putin's illegal invasion. This is a very important opportunity to have conversations about how we can draw that conflict to a conclusion. The Prime Minister spent a lot of time talking to international leaders recently, and I think he's incredibly well placed to have these conversations with President Trump for the benefit not just of Ukraine, but for our own national security as well.
As you mentioned, 3 years on, the anniversary today. Do you think Ukraine, particularly given the rhetoric out of the United States, is more exposed today than at pretty much any point during those 3 years?
I think the risk, the toll, the burden that is being carried by Ukraine is unsustainable for the long term, and it is extraordinary that they've been able to persevere in the way that they have. The United Kingdom has stood shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine throughout that period of 3 years. Just recently, the Prime Minister signed a 100-year agreement with President Zelenskyy, and that is our commitment for the longer term to work with Ukraine to get them through this terribly difficult situation. It's why today that we're announcing that we're expanding the criteria of exclusion that will prevent Russian elites travelling to London and to the United Kingdom in the way that they have done previously. That is a mechanism which will not only enhance our own national security, but puts further pressure on Russia as well. Later on today, the Foreign Secretary will be announcing a range of new sanctions being imposed on Russia. So working with our international allies, we're doing everything that we possibly can to increase pressure on Russia, whilst at the same time continuing to provide support to Ukraine.
But I mean, economic sanctions, firstly, it raises the question why they weren't done already, if they're really that significant. But more importantly, you mentioned working with allies. I mean, economic sanctions without the United States behind you are kind of irrelevant.
Well, this is precisely why the Prime Minister is travelling to Washington to have these conversations with the President later this week. Our relationship with the United States sits at the very bedrock, the heart of NATO, which is the guarantee of European security. And our commitment to NATO is absolutely unshakable. We are a key part of that, along with our allies in the United States. And that's why the Prime Minister will be in Washington having these conversations with the President.
But without trying to be annoying, Minister, that's a sort of tacit acknowledgement that what you're announcing this morning, unless the Prime Minister convinces the President to back it come the meeting this week, is irrelevant.
It certainly isn't irrelevant. What it is a tightening of the screw, applying more pressure to Russia. The announcement that we're making around excluding Russian-backed elites, that is something that hasn't happened previously. This is something that we're doing now. So this will prevent people travelling to the United Kingdom in the way that they have done recently. That's a good thing, and I think that will make a material difference. The sanctions that are going to be announced later on will put more pressure on Russia. So set alongside the support that we're providing for Ukraine, Ukraine, we are doing everything that we possibly can, working with international counterparts to try and bring this conflict to a conclusion.
President Zelenskyy said over the weekend that he's willing to give up the presidency if it meant NATO membership. I guess two questions to that. Should he have to do that? And realistically, whilst President Trump's in the White House, NATO membership's off the table for Ukraine?
Well, the UK government is very clear that Ukraine is on an irreversible path to NATO membership. We think that Ukraine's rightful place is in NATO.
You can't overrule the US on that.
It's not about overruling the US. It's about working closely with our partners in NATO to have these kind of conversations. We think that actually the security guarantor that the United States could play will be absolutely crucial in terms of bringing the conflict to a conclusion in Ukraine. And that's precisely why the Prime Minister will be having these conversations with the President later this week.
If we look back over time, and clearly hindsight is a luxury that we don't always have. But Marco Rubio said an interesting thing in an interview late last week. It sort of implied at times President Zelenskyy doesn't strike the right tone of gratitude towards the West, particularly towards the United States, for the hundreds of billions of dollars of aid that they've received. Receives a new batch and then is always demanding more. Is that is that a fair kind of snapshot with some perspective? And is there a lesson to be learned from that on the behalf of the UK and Europe as you approach conversations with the US?
Well, firstly, I certainly welcome the fact that Secretary of State Rubio has met with Secretary Lavrov in Saudi Arabia. I think that was a very positive move, and hopefully that's part of a process that will at some point lead to a negotiated peace settlement. So that is a very, very positive development. In terms of President Zelenskyy, I think it's hard to overstate the impact that this war has had on the country of Ukraine. Thousands and thousands of people have been killed. While we speak this morning, Ukraine continues to be under continuous attack from Russia. The toll that has taken on the country, the toll that has taken on the political leadership is massive. So our commitment has been unshakable throughout the period of the conflict. We're proud of the contribution, which has been done very much on a cross-party basis, that's gone into supporting Ukraine. That's why the Prime Minister agreed the 100-year agreement. That's why the Prime Minister will be meeting with the President this week and has been talking to international allies over the course of the weekend to make sure that we are best placed to marshal the argument, the resource to bring this conflict to a conclusion. It needs to come to an end, but it will only conclude through a negotiated peace settlement. But the terms of that settlement have to be in accordance with what Ukraine want.
Just finally wanted to get your take on the results of the German election. Is Friedrich Merz someone that Prime Minister Starmer can work closely with?
Yes, and I send my congratulations to the incoming Chancellor. The relationship with Germany is a very important one. The Prime Minister recently met with the previous Chancellor. His Majesty the King conducted a state visit to Germany not so long ago. So they are a vital and key European ally. And whilst we don't yet know precisely what the shape of the coalition will be, we'll clearly want to work as closely as we possibly can with our allies in Germany.
Not many centre-left governments left standing.
That may be the case, but let's see where we get to in the future. And what we will want to do is work closely with all our allies, regardless of their political background.
Dan Jarvis, always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Now, a reminder, the breaking news this morning, the update from the Vatican that came moments ago in terms of the health of the Pope. A statement said he had a good night in hospital, he slept and is resting. Let's get out to Lisa Holland for more details on this. Lisa, a brief statement, as has been par for the course over the last couple of days, but relatively encouraging?
Well, it means that there was no need for any significant medical intervention overnight. Reading between what few words there are, what it doesn't say, of course, is whether or not he was able to, for example, eat breakfast, whether he was able to get out of bed, whether he has any sort of sense of mobility. It doesn't also say whether or not he is alert this morning. Yesterday's medical bulletin said that the Pope was alert and that he had managed to join in prayers, given that, of course, he was very, very absent figure from Vatican City yesterday and St. Peter's Basilica, and of course the day of prayer yesterday. However, there is still deep concern. Fundamentally, the Pope remains in a critical condition. He has double pneumonia, and importantly, yesterday I think was an announcement from the Vatican that he had early signs of kidney failure. I think everybody accepts here that he is in a very fragile state. He is a very fragile 88-year-old man.
Lisa Holland, as always, thanks so much. Still to come here on The Breakfast Show this morning, Germany's Conservatives celebrate electoral success as they come out on top in the country's elections, followed by the far-right AfD party. We'll be talking to Germany's ambassador to London next. Welsh politicians are driving to Ukraine to deliver vehicles and equipment to the front line. We'll talk to one of them who's made that journey. And Hollywood stars walk the red carpet at the SAG Awards with a few surprise winners, of course, with the Oscars to come. What does it all mean? We'll discuss.
This is how you travel when the mafia wants to kill you.
He's almost given up his own freedom, but that's the price he's willing to pay.
Here, they don't just arrest and Ndrangheta mafia members, they also live among them.
Time after time, I've seen the devastating impact of extreme weather and climate change.
We don't have much snow at the moment.
They've had a warm spring and exceptionally hot summer, and that means they're expecting to lose more than 3 times the amount of ice than they usually do.
Flames are still forcing people from their homes and leaving many questioning their futures.
Here was my life. We have nothing. I can't say anything, it's so sad.
This disaster is testing the resolve of everyone on this island.
The only way out now is by boat.
Everything you see is devastated, and the misery being felt by people living here is repeated in towns and villages across Central Europe. Sky News, get the full story first.
Turkey is burying its dead. The loss is profound.
Whole families died in this collapse, generations wiped out. The violence has penetrated the heart of the city rather than being contained to the estates around the edge, and that speaks to the level of anger being felt here.
In Sweden, police have seized a lethal stash. This is just a small sample of the deadly arsenal taken off the streets.
This is an example of an advert, really. Anyone of any age could say, I'll do that for £1 million, and then have to go and shoot someone.
Yes.
I'm Siobhan Robbins, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Berlin.
I saw police being forceful, pushing young men and women to the ground as they made almost 100 arrests. Will the cold affect your voters?
Well, we have a lot of tremendous support.
Free, wherever you get your news.
The people here know that worse storms may well be on their way.
I'm Martha Kellner, and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Mandatory evacuation, you must leave!
For many people, Harvey is far from over.
People here believe the water will be this deep for weeks.
I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's chief North of England correspondent. Are you trying to run me over, Sir Philip?
No, go away.
Look like it, sir. Will you respond to those who made accusations, Sir Philip?
Can you go away?
Sky News, the full story first.
Welcome back to The Breakfast Show. Well, as you can see, the German ambassador to the UK, Miguel Berger, is here, and we'll be discussing the results overnight of the German federal elections in just a moment. But first, a reminder of all the day's top stories. Liz got those for us.
Thank you, Wilfred. Now, the Vatican says the Pope has had a good night in hospital, slept and is now resting. We were told yesterday the 88-year-old was in a critical condition and had developed a kidney problem. Live pictures there of the Vatican. Germany's Conservative Party have come first in a national election and must now form a coalition. Voters wait to see if he will break with convention and invite the far right into government. The AfD came second and welcomed the prospect.
Our hand will always remain outstretched for participation in government, to implement the will of the people, the will of Germany. We are ready to participate in government.
Elsewhere, on the anniversary of Putin's war in Ukraine, the UK introduces a new raft of sanctions targeting the country's billionaire oligarchs. We report on the toll of the war and what it's having on a generation of young Russian men.
The military graves are the ones marked out by flags, and there are dozens and dozens of them. And this is just one cemetery in one town in one region.
Palestinian militant group Hamas has said it won't engage in any further ceasefire talks with Israel until prisoners are freed as part of the current deal. Israel has delayed the release of more than 600 Palestinian prisoners, claiming Hamas had breached the terms of the agreement. And a campaign group is threatening to sue the government and take legal action unless it reconsiders its rejection of compensation for millions of women who were impacted by the changes to the state pension age. The Prime Minister says any deal for WASPy women would cost taxpayers over £10 billion.
Yeah, great stuff. Thanks so much for that. Well, let's return to that top story, the results of the German election, where the Conservative Christian Democrats and their Bavarian sister party, the Christian Social Union, have won the country's national election. The ambassador to the UK, Miguel Berger, joins us now. Very good morning to you, Ambassador. Thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, good morning.
Your initial reaction after what I imagine was quite a long night for you. So again, thank you for joining us bright and early.
No, sure. We had a long election night. The final results came before midnight. Yeah, the situation is quite clear, I must say. So, as you've said, the Christian Democrats have won the election. There's only one viable option, and that is to work with the Social Democrats of Chancellor Scholz in what we call a grand coalition. Christian Democrats with Social Democrats.
Why is that the only viable option? Is it not fair to say that the two winning parties, the first two positions, could form a coalition?
Mathematically, they could, but politically, it's not possible. And the Christian Democrats, all parties in the political center, have ruled out to work with the far-right AfD. So they will be, with their 20%, the main opposition party in the German parliament, but no coalition with them. That was made very clear yesterday by Friedrich Merz.
It's clear that the CDU, of course, won the most votes. I mean, the other big takeaway, I think it's fair to say, is that it was a very bad night for the governing Social Democrats, SDP. Is it fair on the electorate that they get to stay in government?
That's the way how it works in coalition governments. Obviously, for them, it will be difficult. There will be some changes. Chancellor Scholz has already made clear that he will step aside. So there might also be, we'll see some new faces there. But, given the situation we are in, it's the only viable option to get a majority in parliament. And, we are in such a difficult geopolitical situation. That's why we need to form a stable government as quickly as possible in Germany. And that's what Friedrich Merz promised yesterday, that he will sit down this week to start coalition negotiations.
How long will that take?
That might take till Easter, so I'm very optimistic that in 6-8 weeks we will have a new government. And as I said, if I look at the situation today, 3 years of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, a very unstable geopolitical situation, we need very quickly a stable German government in order to take the necessary decisions.
What will be the change from Olaf Scholz to Friedrich Merz on the topic of the war with Ukraine and defence spending? Is he going to be tougher on Russia than Olaf Scholz was?
I think both of them are tough on Russia. Now, currently, the question is really what role will Europe play in the negotiations? That's why the visit of President Macron to Washington today, but also the Prime Minister on Thursday, will be so important. And I can tell you that France, Germany, the UK, we are very closely coordinating our security policy because we all have the joint interest to be at the table, but also to achieve a just and lasting peace for Ukraine, which guarantees their sovereignty.
Is Friedrich Merz more pro-UK? Is he an Anglophile?
He is definitely an Anglophile, but you have many Anglophiles in Germany, so we will work for the bilateral treaty, which was started by the previous government. Our security cooperation is very close. We are partners and friends in NATO, in G7. All of that is going to continue, but what we need really is that the biggest economy in Europe, the biggest country, which is Germany, needs a stable government which is able to lead in Europe.
I guess, change helps turn over the leaf, start a new chapter. And clearly we've had that here. Brexit caused a lot of division, but the Conservatives and Boris Johnson are no longer in power. Is it fair to say that that's needed a little bit in Europe as well to move on to a new chapter where relations can be rationalised? I guess there's a view sometimes from the UK that barriers to trade are erected for the sake of it as opposed to what's sensible. Will this be the start of a new sensible chapter of fresh negotiations on trade between the EU and the UK?
We would be glad to have these negotiations. We are going to have an EU-UK summit on the 19th of May. The government has laid out proposals for the reset with the European Union. And we are absolutely open for that. So no hard feelings there. It's an absolute openness. And I would even say, as I said, if we look at the world around us, but also what is happening in the United States, we need to cooperate in Europe on security, on trade, on investment, on many, many fronts, because our governments have to deliver. The only way to reduce the influence of the far right is by delivering on the key tasks.
And just finally, I guess, to bring it back to the AfD, the far-right party who got nearly 20% and doubled their vote since last time. If a grand coalition is formed with the political establishment, the CDU and the SPD, and it fails, what will happen next time? The AfD will probably surge again.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. This is a danger, but not only in Germany, in many other countries. So the only way is really for governments to deliver on the key topics. And in Germany, that's economic reform, investment in infrastructure, migration, very similar challenges as we are facing, any government is facing in Europe, but also here in the UK. The only way is really delivery.
Ambassador Berger, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Great to chat, as always. Lots more still to come here on The Breakfast Show. We will be bringing you a live press conference with the leader of the AfD, by the way, a little bit later this morning. We'll also be talking to two Welsh politicians driving to Ukraine to deliver vital supplies to the front line. We'll be right back.
We arrive. A secret hospital hidden in the Myanmar jungle, treating the victims of this bloody war. This is Myanmar today. Its military rulers don't want the world to see, but we have.
I fight for my own future. I fight for my generation's futures.
This is an actual crime.
They don't care for that.
Myanmar army is only a couple of kilometers away.
So this is a major humanitarian disaster.
Paris reverberated to the sights, sounds and smells of conflict.
There's a focal point to all this anger, and that is Emmanuel Macron.
I'm Adam Parsons, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Brussels.
There are dozens of people desperately clambering to get onto that boat. It is a chaotic scene, but it's being watched by dozens of French police officers on the beach.
I've reported on migration across Europe, close up on the ground, understanding that sense of desperation and meeting the criminal gangs behind it.
This old fishing boat set off from the Libyan port of Tobruk. There were 606 people who were on board.
So we've been distributing life jackets to all the people on board this boat, and now the first person is coming on board.
This is the ugly side of Italian football.
In Italy, everything is really organized.
Football's problems with hooliganism, racism were just dormant, and now they're back and they're getting worse. We cover so many countries, languages and cultures and work hard to gain trust to bring you the full story first.
Help is slowly reaching these places.
It's not just homes, but whole streets like this one that have been reduced to rubble and dust.
This is a picture of destruction.
Everywhere you look in this mountaintop community, there is absolute devastation.
These are the settlers in waiting, keen to start a new life, to annex Gaza for Israel.
The least we can do is just kick them out of our land.
Gaza, which is just 2 miles in that direction, is under attack again. Getting the chance to tell people's stories, it's a privilege.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. I'm ready. Are you? Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Welcome back. Campaigners for women who lost out after an increase in the state pension age have threatened the government with legal action. Let's get the latest on this story. Sadia's here with it. Sadia, just quickly remind us what we're talking about. This is the WASPy women and why it's got to this potential stage of legal action.
So, yeah, they're called the WASPy women collectively. They're more than 3.5 million women who were born in the 1950s, and they were affected by a 1990s change to the state pension age, which brought their age in line with men. Now, they say at the time they weren't informed on time about this change, and therefore they couldn't make the required retirement plans that they wanted to do, and they have long been campaigning for compensation. Now they're saying that they've been gaslit by the government because they were led to believe, they say, in the run-up to the election that they'd be supported by the government and that they would end up with this compensation package that they'd been after. Now, you may remember during the election, the run-up, we saw key members of the government, who are now key members of the government, at the time they were in opposition, showing their support, taking pictures with the WASPy women. You had the likes of Liz Kendall, Rachel Reeves, Angela Rayner, and the Prime Minister. But now in government, they're apologising to the women, saying that they're unable to give them what would end up being a £10.5 billion compensation package. And the reason they've given is they say that by 2006, almost all of the women were then aware that this change had taken place. Now, to be clear, the government had never promised anything substantial. They hadn't ever made an actual commitment, just showed support. It didn't
get as far as the manifesto and anything explicit.
No, exactly, nothing like that. Now, so what the women are now saying is they want a judicial review. So they've sent a letter before action to the government. Essentially, that gives the government a 2-week window to respond. They say that they want to take this now to the High Court. They've launched a £75,000 crowd justice campaign in order to do so, and the government has 2 weeks to respond.
Sadia, as always, thanks so much. Now, 2 members of the Welsh Parliament are driving from Wales to Kiev later this week to deliver the vehicles and supplies that the frontline needs. Mick Antowiv, who's from Ukraine, and Alan Davies will make the journey along with members of the Senate and the group within it that campaigns for Ukraine. Well, they're both able to join me now. A very good morning to you both. Thanks for joining us. Talk me through, Alan, the sort of main reason for why you're doing this.
We're doing this because it's the right thing to do. In many ways, Ukraine is Europe's front line today. And the people fighting to the east of where we are at the moment are fighting for our liberty, our values, and our freedoms. And it's important, I think, especially when there's some international issues around, but all of us join together and say to the people of Ukraine, 3 years after this brutal invasion, we remain with you, we are steadfast behind you, and we will continue to support you.
Mick, this isn't the first time you've done this.
No, this is my 12th time, but I have family in Ukraine, so I've been a regular visitor to Ukraine since independence. I have family that are fighting on the front line, family that have had to move because of the missile attacks. So this is deeply personal for me, as well as being a Welsh politician.
And Mick, tell us what you're actually delivering and where it comes from, who's funded it.
Well, the first thing is we're taking another 5 vehicles over, 4x4 pickups. Those are absolutely essential. They save lives on the front line of Ukraine, enabling the injured and the wounded to be got to hospitals to take supplies to the front line. But also, very importantly, we have donated medical supplies, very important trauma supplies for the hospitals for treating the tourniquets, the trauma bandages, 5 carloads of that this makes up now almost 40 vehicles that we've taken over since the start of the war from Wales on behalf of all political parties in Wales.
And talk us through the sort of scale of appreciation you get when you do trips like this, and the way in which it's received. It's been interesting the last week or so seeing the likes of Marco Rubio criticise a lack of gratitude from Ukrainians for all the aid that they've received.
The people in Ukraine see the same news as we do. They hear the same words from Washington as we do. They're very aware of what is happening at the moment. And there's real appreciation. I don't think you can understate the amount of uncertainty there is here at the moment, and some real fear. These people have sacrificed everything for their freedoms in the last 3 years, and they recognize that they can't do it alone, and we know that. And when we speak to people, as we did last night when we arrived here, and we will this evening when we get to Kyiv, they recognize what we're doing, driving these thousands of kilometers here to support them. And they know that this isn't us doing this. This is whole populations and countries and nations supporting them. And they recognize that support. They are grateful for it. They appreciate it. But they also know that this is something we're doing together. But we are taking on a dictatorship in Putin. We're taking on the might of Russian fascism, and no country alone can do that. And the support that we've gathered together has been the support of ordinary people in Wales, people who've gathered together, donated funds and donated support to us. And they recognise that, they know that, and they appreciate it.
Mick, I wonder what your family members you mentioned fighting on the front line are feeling at the moment. No doubt enormous gratitude for the deliveries that you're able to bring. But if we're all blunt and honest about it, it's nothing compared to what President Trump could deliver if he wanted to.
Listen, I speak to family members, I speak to people and friends very close to the front line every day. And in many ways, there's a bit of anger. There's a lack of understanding how Trump in America can be allying himself to a war criminal, someone who's clearly committed war crimes, massacres, who's invaded a sovereign country. And that's the bit I think they don't understand. But following on from what was just said, they are so deeply grateful to the fact that we are actually there. It's one thing to deliver supplies and support, but actually being there and saying, you are not alone, we are standing with you, is really, really important. They're now looking more than ever towards Europe as being the body that has to back them, because the war is the front line of European democracy and the rule of law. They recognise it, and I think we are now increasingly in Europe recognising it as well.
Mick and Alan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Safe travels, gentlemen, and thanks for all you do. Now, back here in the UK, Britain's armed forces are continuing to train Ukrainian recruits to help in the fight back. Let's bring in now our correspondent Asha Hiranag, who's in East Anglia this morning, to see some of this personnel in action and the training going on. Asha, what have you been witnessing?
It's been a really insightful morning, actually, because we've been given some quite extraordinarily rare access to the training that Ukrainian soldiers are receiving from members of the British Armed Forces ever since June 2022. I'm standing in what could be, Wilf, any town or village, anywhere across the world, I suppose. But what they have done here is try to replicate areas where you'd have real-life scenarios that these soldiers might be walking into. So look at this, a burnt-out car used for training exercises. Let's have a little walk around and show you what this looks like. And what I found fascinating is a lot of these buildings are kind of built to look as though they are from Eastern European countries. You've got piles of rubble deliberately put here to kind of recreate the environment that they will be going into when it comes to frontline combat. Inside, they're essentially just veneers, really. Inside, it's just a barren brick building. I've seen bed frames, wardrobes and such like. And they've made it so realistic that there's a hotel on site, a pub, a cafe, a number of shops, just to give people that kind of real-life simulation. There's a pharmacy, actually, just over to my right. But it gives people who are coming down here to be recruited, to get that infantry training, to get that leadership instructor training before they go out onto the front line. It's giving them that real life experience, and it's all preparing them for that effective frontline combat. We know that so many of the volunteer recruits that have come through this programme as part of Operation Interflex have gone straight into facing that Russian aggression over in Ukraine. 51,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been trained not only by people here in Britain, UK military personnel, some 1,000 of them are being deployed to make sure this training happens, but they're working in partnership with 13 other nations, from Australia to New Zealand to Denmark to Norway to Sweden and most recently Albania. But all of this, getting a glimpse into how this training works, has been really insightful for kind of getting a glimpse really into what they're going through over there.
Ashton, thanks so much for that. Ashton Hirag there in East Anglia. Now, as we wrap up this hour, we're going to reflect a little bit on Hollywood's biggest names turning out last night for the Screen Actor Guild's awards, the SAG Awards. Of course, it's the final step before the Oscars. And let's have a little look at some of the key winners. Now, the winner for essentially Best Film, this is called the Screen Actors Guild. So they call this the Best Ensemble Cast Performance, which I think we take as Best Film.
I would,
definitely. In this, there's no Best Film category, so this kind of is Best Film. The winner, Conclave. Of course, a film about picking the next pope. Have you seen this one, guys?
No, I'm waiting until the weekend. This is my movie night, Friday night.
It's been available, this one, for a little while. This is the one I have seen, actually, of all of them. I loved it. No, really loved it. Yeah. I don't want to ruin the ending, so I'm not going to say my next thought. But I really loved it. And I mean, you talk about ensemble cast, if that's what they're calling it. The cast is epic. So I can see why it won that award. Now, Ralph Fiennes, who I think is fantastic, didn't win Best Actor.
Yes.
But also, nor did Adrian Brody, who's probably the favourite.
It went to Timothée Chalamet for his portrayal of a young Bob Dylan, who I thought, actually, you know, he did things like learn how to play the guitar, and he was in conversation with the Bob Dylan, who gave him the green light to do this, and was really happy with his performance throughout. So I think this is, you know, potentially a sign of things to come for the Oscars for him.
I've got a controversial view.
Tell us. Love it.
I don't understand why they make films like biopics about people while they're still alive.
I
feel like that's more epic when they're not with us.
OK,
Is that just point?
On that controversial thought, we have to leave it for this hour. Lots more to discuss after this short break. Coming up in Sky News Breakfast.
Weeknights on Sky News.
This is your chance. Tell people. Welcome to the Politics Hub.
Our police force has apologised. If you want to find out about Grimsby, you come to the docks.
I'm live in Jerusalem.
Are you not concerned that that could lead to all-out war?
Hello there, good evening. There are fears of an upsurge in violence. What's at stake here?
You are watching the press preview, a first look at the front pages as they arrive.
Good morning to you. It's 8 o'clock. We've had an update on the Pope's health. We'll have it for you in a moment.
Germany's far-right surges into second place. They're giving a news conference this hour.
And the government here hopes another round of Russia sanctions will help Ukraine.
It's Monday, the 24th of February. Your headlines. The Vatican says Pope Francis had a good night in hospital, slept and is resting. Germany's Conservatives celebrate success while the country's far-right doubles its vote share. Leaders begin arriving in Kiev for a summit on the third anniversary of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Conclave takes the top prize at last night's SAG Awards. Next stop, the Oscars. We'll tell you why there's plenty to play for. Very good morning to you. We start with the development on the Pope's health and the Vatican saying that the pontiff had a good night in hospital and is resting. Let's bring in Lisa Holland, who's been live in Vatican City for us for over a week now, keeping us up to speed on all these latest developments. Lisa, frame this latest one for us.
Yes, well, I think it's more about what's not being said rather than what is being said. In just a few words that the Vatican has given us this morning, they said that the Pope had slept, that he is resting, that he'd had a good night. So I think what we can take from that is that there has been no need for any significant medical intervention overnight, the like of which we saw, of course, on Saturday when the Pope had what the Vatican described as a prolonged respiratory crisis. Now, that required some high-flow oxygen intervention. Also, the Pope on Saturday had several blood transfusions, and the Pope's condition deteriorated to the point where the Vatican itself described the Pope's condition as critical. Really, over the course of recent days, the very first bulletin of the day has always been quite short, and then we will gather more information throughout the course of the day. But also, I think what we can read from that is that there's no information as to whether the Pope has eaten today. Clearly, someone who is so fragile, so poorly, whether they're managing to eat is a very important bit of information. And I think that the Vatican knows that. And previously, for example, towards the start of last week, the Vatican was saying in these morning briefings whether or not the Pope had eaten. Also no word whether or not the Pope is alert. That is something that they also tend to comment on, and also whether he's been able physically to get out of bed and into a chair. So these are all signs to enable us to kind of read between the lines as to how things are. The fact remains the Pope is in a critical condition. He's very fragile. And yesterday in the medical update, the Vatican said that he also had the early signs of kidney failure. So I think that from going into hospital 10 days ago with bronchitis, that led to a respiratory tract infection, then double pneumonia. Now he has these other problems emerging around his body.
Lisa, thank you, and thank you again for keeping us up to speed on this latest situation for the Pope in the Vatican there. Now, the stage is set for coalition building in Germany after yesterday's election. The country's Conservatives came out on top with almost 30% of the vote. But the story of the night was the surge in support for the far right, placing them in second position. The question now is whether the established parties will continue their long-held pledge of a firewall blocking the far-right AfD from joining a coalition. Well, last hour I spoke to Germany's ambassador to the UK about the possibility of the far-right surging even further if the CDU and the SPD form a coalition that then fails.
This is a danger, but not only in Germany, in many other countries. So the only way is really for governments to deliver on the key topics. And in Germany, that's economic reform, investment in infrastructure, migration. Very similar challenges as we are facing, any government is facing in Europe, but also here in the UK. The only way is really delivery.
I do just want to mention that a press conference being held live by the leader of the AfD, the far-right party, Alice Weidel. You can scan the QR code that's coming your way if you want to listen to that. But we'll bring you the headlines from it as and when they cross. Meanwhile, as you can see, our Europe correspondent, Adam Parsons, is joining us live from Berlin. Adam, great to have you with us. By Easter, the ambassador suggested that there be a government in place. That's, weeks, not days, of course, at a critical time for Europe, for Germany.
Yeah, a critical point, and I think a point where Friedrich Merz will have to hit the ground running. This is the man who will be Germany's next chancellor and has already this morning talked of American electoral interference, referring, of course, to Elon Musk promoting Alice Weidel, the leader of the AfD. And I think we are at such a volatile moment that even though Friedrich Merz is really, by history, a man who promotes close relations between Europe and the United States, I think he is going to now potentially go in the other direction and start talking about a need for Europe and Germany in particular to be much more self-reliant. And I think that reflects what is perhaps the most significant element of European politics at the moment, which is that realization that the old transatlantic partnership has frayed. And whether you are in Germany, France, United Kingdom, or anywhere else, you're suddenly thinking, right, how do we rebuild away from having an American shoulder to cry on? So I think that will be a big question for Mr. Merz. Another will be about funding for Ukraine, something that he remains in favor of. Remember, Germany is the second biggest backer of Ukraine behind the United States, something that Germans have often complained that they just don't get the credit for. So that's all on his in tray. But of course, importantly, how does he cope with this resurgent AfD who've doubled their support from 10 to 20%? How does he create a government that will function? And how does he deal with the fact that the AfD and Die Linke, the far left, who have also done pretty well in this election, will try to stymie him at any opportunity?
Adam, great stuff. Thanks so much for that. Adam Parsons for us live in Berlin. We're now joined by the German conservative politician Markus Ferber. He's a member of the Christian Social Union, which, of course, is in coalition, essentially, with the CDU that won last night. More than coalition, partners with each other. Thanks so much for joining us. Is this a night of victory for your parties?
Of course, it is a time of victory. We won the elections clearly. We are the number one. Everyone congratulated already yesterday evening Friedrich Merz to become the next chancellor. But now the problem will be, as we have a fully proportionate system to build a government, the only option I see, and which is possible according to the results, is with the Social Democrats, which is shrinking possibilities for negotiations. On the other hand, everyone knows we need very quickly a stable government for Germany and for European Union. And therefore, I hope that everyone understands what now has to be done.
I wanted to pick up on a phrase that our reporter there, Adam Parsons, kind of hinted at, that Friedrich Merz has said overnight. He said, quote, "It's an absolute priority to strengthen Europe as quickly as possible so that step by step we actually achieve independence from the United States of America." Can you expand on what he meant by that?
It's very obvious. We saw a few weeks, 2 weeks ago, the speech of J.D. Vance in Munich at the Munich Security Conference, where he clearly said that United States are no longer threatened by China and Russia. They are threatened by Europeans. And that was really a wake-up call that we have to become more independent. We have to safeguard our security by ourselves. That is the main issue. Defense policy, and that's why I think it makes sense what Friedrich Merz said. We have to become more independent, especially conventionally, against an attack of Russia. And what President Trump said in the last days about Ukraine and responsibility of Mr. Zelenskyy, which we don't share, shows that US is not a friend or ally you can rely anymore.
Are you as confident as it sounded like your ambassador to London was when I spoke to him last hour, that the outcome of negotiations will definitely be a coalition between the SPD and the CDU-CSU?
That is the only thing which I see as an option. Everyone agreed that there will be no coalition with the AfD, and AfD will be in economical terms, in external policies, defense policies, a nightmare for Germany. They are Russian-friendly, they are against European membership, against the euro, all things where Germany has huge benefits out of. and therefore it makes no sense. On the other hand, you have a strong left party, which is not on your slide, but they had 8.6% as well. Extreme left, who want to open our borders more and more for migration. And only with the Greens is no majority, and therefore the only option we have at the moment is with the Social Democrats. And I think we should pick this option and form a coalition as soon as possible.
What will that coalition mean for defence spending and for Ukraine? Will it mean more of the same, or will Friedrich Merz take this in a much more meaningful direction in terms of, for example, spending on defence?
I think we have to do both. Firstly, we have to strengthen our own defence capacities, and that means we have to do it in a European context. Not everyone has to be able to do everything in Europe, but together we have to be protected. So therefore, we need a good planning, and not only, as we had in the last time, 100 billion euros as a so-called Sondervermögen, which was additional money, but it did not create capacity for industry. So capacity building in Europe is a very important issue as well. That means stabilizing the funds for defense. And on the other hand, it is clear that we continue the help for the Ukraine. Germany is number 2 donor after United States, and we will continue doing so. That was the clear promise of Friedrich Merz, and there he is in continuity with the existing or not re-elected government.
Does Friedrich Merz want to rationalise trading relationships with the United Kingdom?
I think he will. And, he has long experience in international relations. He started his career a long time ago as a member of the European Parliament. So he even know the good old times when the United Kingdom was in the European Union. And he was for a long time the chairman of the so-called Atlantic Bridge, which is economical association between Germany entrepreneurs and US entrepreneurs. And therefore, I think he has good relations in all capitals needed for that, not only London and Washington, but on the other hand, we have huge problems with German-French relationships. Mr. Scholz had huge problems to find common ground with Emmanuel Macron. So I hope we can improve that as well to give new push for European integration, especially in defense and foreign affairs, security policy. And there I see a lot of possibilities to cooperate with the United Kingdom as well. We are both in NATO. UK is a very important partner in the United Nations, and therefore good relations with UK are key for Germany.
Markus Ferber, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Congratulations on your party's victory last night. Right, time for some of the day's other news now. Leah's back with that.
Thank you so much, Wilfred. A Palestinian militant group, Hamas, says it will not hold any more talks with Israel on the next phase of the ceasefire agreement. This is until prisoners, they say, who were due to be freed on Saturday are let go. Israel said it delayed the release of more than 600 Palestinian prisoners as it wanted guarantees from Hamas that more hostages will be freed without what they called humiliating ceremonies. The White House has backed Israel's decision, saying it was an appropriate response to Hamas's treatment of hostages. A body has been found in the search for missing runner Jenny Hall. The 23-year-old was last seen on Tuesday leaving her home in Barracks Farm, County Durham. Officers say the body was found in a remote area of Teesdale, and they don't believe there's any suspicious circumstances. A British couple in their 70s have reportedly been arrested by the Taliban in Afghanistan. Peter and Barbie Reynolds have run education programmes in the country for 18 years. Their children say they were detained earlier this month, but the reason for their arrests is unknown. Pharmacists are warning patients that services may be reduced or cut off entirely unless the government promises more funding. The National Pharmacy Association says issues like the national insurance rise will mean pharmacists in England will face a £250 million of unplanned costs come this April. And the number of homes in Britain valued at £1 million or more has risen by around 30% over the past 5 years. This is according to property firm Savills. 1 in every 42 homes in Britain is valued at £1 million plus.
Yeah, great stuff. Thank you. Now, today, the anniversary of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And Number 10 is setting out fresh sanctions, this time targeting the country's billionaire oligarchs. We'll be talking about that with Mari in just a moment. But first, let's tell you about a summit that President Zelenskyy is holding in Kiev this morning. Deborah Haynes is there for us as ever. Deborah, great to have you with us. What is the significance of this gathering? Who's there and who's not there?
Well, it's going to be a show of support, really, from European and other leaders. You've got the Prime Minister of Canada, who's also due to be here at this meeting. Other leaders will also be joining online. It's a show of support for Volodymyr Zelenskyy as he leads this country into the 4th year of Russia's full-scale war. But he is facing extraordinary pressure. It was hard enough to withstand that initial Russian assault on this capital exactly 3 years ago today, with missiles raining down, air raid sirens sounding out, Russian forces pouring across the border with Belarus and also Russia, trying to take the capital. They failed in that initial push, but the battles are still raging in the east, and that was with Ukraine's allies united. Yes, they were slow and have faced criticism for the amount of support that they've given to Ukraine. You'll remember at first it was the anti-tank missiles, then it evolved to tanks, then to fighter jets, then to long-range missiles, then to allowing Ukraine to fire these long-range missiles against targets inside Russia. Each hurdle a struggle for Ukraine to overcome. But now it faces potentially its biggest hurdle in the form of Donald Trump, who has come into the White House saying he wants to end the war, but seeing his role more as a mediator rather than aligned with Ukraine. And that is very uncomfortable, not just for Kyiv, but also for European allies. So you can expect to hear lots of words for support for Ukraine. But on the same day, France's President Macron is going to be going to Washington to meet with Donald Trump as part of this effort by the Europeans and Canada to keep Donald Trump, or to try to bring Donald Trump back into the fold, rather than have him increasingly aligned with Vladimir Putin, and speaking language which is so shocking for people here, saying that Ukraine is to blame for the war and calling Volodymyr Zelenskyy a dictator. So very, very difficult times, but this country knows hardship. And one thing that you can tell by talking to people is that even though they really don't need this grief from the White House, they do know they need the US to be alongside. And even if America decides it won't do that, then this country will be making contingency plans to try to go it alone with its European and other allies.
Deborah, easier said than done, of course, but thanks so much, as always, our Defence and Security Editor there, Deborah Haynes, in Kiev. Mari, it's a topic that came up when we were talking with the government earlier. Just remind us what they're trying to announce on their own today.
So the government, the Home Office, is announcing essentially a new raft of sanctions for Russian oligarchs, so those who've got close links to the Kremlin. So they're expanding the criteria of preventing these people from being able to enter into the UK. So those who provide support for the Russian state, those who owe their status or their wealth to the Russian state, and those who enjoy access to the highest levels of the Russian state. Now, really interestingly, you put to Dan Jarvis, the minister, that some of these sanctions might not really matter or might not really be very relevant if the US isn't also doing the same and backing it. And he, to an extent, didn't deny that. I think we can have a listen now.
This is precisely why the Prime Minister is travelling to Washington to have these conversations with the President later this week. Our relationship with the United States sits at the very bedrock, the heart of NATO, which is the guarantee of European security, and our commitment to NATO is absolutely unshakable. We are a key part of that, along with our allies in the United States, and that's why the Prime Minister will be in Washington having these conversations with the President.
But without trying to be annoying, Minister, that's a sort of tacit acknowledgement that what you're announcing this morning, unless the Prime Minister convinces the President to back it come the meeting this week, is irrelevant.
It certainly isn't irrelevant. What it is a tightening of the screw, applying more pressure to Russia. The announcement that we're making around excluding Russian-backed elites, that is something that hasn't happened previously. This is something that we're doing now. So this will prevent people travelling to the United Kingdom in the way that they have done recently. That's a good thing, and I think that will make a material difference. The sanctions that are going to be announced later on will put more pressure on Russia. So set alongside the support that we're providing for Ukraine, we are doing everything that we possibly can, working with international counterparts to try and bring this conflict to a conclusion.
It's you said a sort of tacit acknowledgement. He said they're tightening of the screw when Ukraine needs a bazooka. I mean, quite literally. And again, it just brings the focus back once again to these meetings in Washington. Actually, President Macron first, and then Prime Minister Starmer.
Yeah, so President Macron meeting Trump today. So he will be the first European leader after all. And then the PM will be going and meeting Trump on Thursday. And so the stakes are incredibly high in terms of what Keir Starmer is, you know, wanting, expecting to be able to achieve with that bilateral meeting with Donald Trump. Realistically, there's been a lot of speculation around whether some kind of an offering on defence spending, for instance, might be offered as a gesture to Donald Trump to show and demonstrate that the UK is really taking his comments around defence spending seriously. And then in the meantime, before that meeting, lots of other heavy diplomacy is going to be happening this week. So we know that there's a virtual meeting of G7 leaders convened by the Canadian Prime Minister happening today. Keir Starmer will be on that call and will be speaking on that call later this morning. Also, there is a virtual Ukraine summit that the PM will also be attending. And finally, this evening, there will also be a Ukraine reception in number 10 Downing Street as well. And that will be for members of the Ukrainian community and those who played a role in supporting them. So there's a lot going on, not just today, but really a bumper week.
All right, great stuff. As always, thanks so much. Now, during the summit in Kiev, President Zelenskyy will hope to cover security guarantees for his country as the United States, of course, continues to make moves towards a peace deal with Russia. Well, President Trump's recent actions seem to have given Moscow renewed confidence in their so-called special operation. For some Russian families who've lost loved ones say they've paid a heavy price for the 3-year war. Our Moscow correspondent, Ivor Bennett, has this report for us.
Around Moscow, you see the word victory. Victory will be ours, this sign reads. But do peace talks still count as a win? The Kremlin's war in Ukraine wasn't supposed to last this long. 3 years that have seen Russia itself invaded. But the mood in Moscow is triumphant. Relations with the US are thawing and currents shifting in Russia's favor. Nothing will feel like a victory for Yelena, though, no matter how the war ends. Her 18-year-old son, Valentin, was killed in Russia's Kursk region in September, soon after Ukraine's incursion there.
Sometimes I sit and think who my grandchildren could have been. It's impossible to live like this. It's very hard for me to be without him. I still wait for him to come back home every day, even though I saw his body. I still can't believe it. I want all mothers to see their children come home.
Yelena made this video in memory of Valentin, who she says was excited to do his military service. The Kremlin promised conscripts wouldn't be involved in combat, but after being sent to the border, the war came to him.
It should be specially trained people there, not children. They were taken from home, from a mother's nest, and brought to some unknown place where there is shooting. What kind of warrior is he? He's not a warrior.
She even wrote to Vladimir Putin, asking for an explanation. But no reply. All she has instead is a grave and her grief.
Russia doesn't publish its casualty figures, and it's only when you come to a place like this that you get a sense of the scale of the losses. The military graves are the ones marked out by flags, and there are dozens and dozens of them. And this is just one cemetery in one town in one region.
Back in Moscow, honours for those who do return. and an unwavering belief that Russia won't be defeated.
The victory will be significant. The main thing is for this to end quickly. But in any case, we will make every effort to ensure that victory is still ours. No one will take it away from us.
Vladimir Putin appears increasingly confident too. On Defender of the Fatherland Day, a focus on Russia's losses, but it seems gains are now within reach. Ivor Bennett, Sky News, Moscow.
Much more throughout the day on the third anniversary, of course, of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Moving on to news here now. Well, campaigners for women who lost out after an increase in the state pension age have threatened the government with legal action. Sadie is here with this story. Sadie, just remind us what we're talking about here, the so-called WASPy women, and what this latest development is.
So there are more than 3.5 million of these women who were born in the 1950s and who say that they weren't informed in a timely manner when that state pension age was changed in the 1990s. They've long been campaigning for compensation because they say they weren't able to make retirement plans properly. Now they're accusing the government of gaslighting them, saying that they had hoped that Labour, when it was in opposition, had shown support, that when they come into government that they would give them some sort of compensation package. They say they were led to believe this, and you may remember in the run-up to the elections, there we go, some pictures of the Prime Minister at the time, who was a leader of the opposition, photographed alongside some of these women, as were other members of the now government. They've now apologised, saying that the taxpayers simply can't justify this £10.5 billion compensation package that would have to be given, because by 2006, the Prime Minister says that all of these 1950s-born women were made aware of that change. To be clear, the government never actually promised anything. There was no firm commitment, just a show of support. But it has, we know, made payments to other victims of, like, for example, the post office scandal and the infected blood scandal. So the WASPy women were expecting something would be there for them. Now they're saying that they're being gaslighted. They've given the government what is called a letter before action. That is a formal mechanism before it goes to the High Court for judicial review, in which case the WASPy women would have to prove that the government's decision not to give them compensation was legally wrong. They've launched a £75,000 crowd justice campaign to pay for that, and the government has 2 weeks to respond.
Sadia, great stuff. Thanks so much. Still to come here on The Breakfast Show this morning, well, after 3 years of war in Ukraine, the government announces more sanctions on Russia. We'll get the view of the opposition on that. And we'll also catch up with Sam Coates about this morning's episode of Politics at Jack and Sam's, where they're discussing the third anniversary of Ukraine's invasion. Discussing the results of the SAG Awards, of course, the Oscars up next.
This is how you travel when the mafia wants to kill you.
He's almost given up his own freedom, but that's the price he's willing to pay.
Here, they don't just arrest and Ndrangheta mafia members, they also live among them.
Time after time, I've seen the devastating impact of extreme weather and climate change.
We don't have much snow at the moment.
They've had a warm spring and exceptionally hot summer, and that means they're expecting to lose more than 3 times the amount of ice than they usually do.
Flames are still forcing people from their homes and leaving many questioning their futures.
Here was my life. We have nothing. I can't say anything, it's so sad.
This disaster is testing the resolve of everyone on this island. The only way out now is by boat.
Everything you see is devastated, and the misery being felt by people living here is repeated in towns and villages across Central Europe. Sky News, get the full story first.
Turkey is burying its dead. The loss is profound.
Whole families died in this collapse, generations wiped out.
The violence has penetrated the heart of the city rather than being contained to the estates around the edge, and that speaks to the level of anger being felt here. In Sweden, police have seized a lethal stash This is just a small sample of the deadly arsenal taken off the streets.
This is an example of an advert, really. Anyone of any age could say, I'll do that for £1 million and then have to go and shoot someone.
Yes.
I'm Siobhan Robbins, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Berlin.
I saw police being forced or pushing young men and women to the ground as they made almost 100 arrests. Will the cold affect your voters?
Well, we have a lot of tremendous support.
Free wherever you get your news. The people here know that worse storms may well be on their way. I'm Martha Kellner and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Mandatory evacuation, you must leave!
For many people, Harvey is far from over.
People here believe the water will be this deep for weeks.
I'm Greg Milam and I'm Sky's chief North of England correspondent.
Are you trying to run me over, Sir Philip?
No, go away.
Look like it, sir. Will you respond to those who made accusations, Sir Philip?
Can you go away?
Sky News, the full story first.
Welcome back to The Breakfast Show. Sam is here. As you can see, we'll be discussing the latest takeaways from his podcast in just a moment. First reminder of all the latest top stories there.
Thank you, Wilfred. We'll start with the Vatican. They say that the Pope has had a good night in hospital, slept and is now resting. We're told yesterday the 88-year-old was in a critical condition and had developed a kidney problem. Leader of Germany's far-right party has said blocking the AfD from joining a coalition would be undemocratic. The Conservatives came out on top with almost 30% of the vote and will now work to form that coalition, while the AfD came second, doubling their vote share since the last election.
Friedrich Merz hat sich festgelegt.
Friedrich Merz has decided to maintain a blockade mentality against the AfD. We think this is undemocratic.
On the anniversary of Putin's war in Ukraine, the UK introduces a new raft of sanctions targeting the country's billionaire oligarchs. We'll report on the toll the war is taking on a generation of young Russian men.
The military graves are the ones marked out by flags, and there are dozens and dozens of them. And this is just one cemetery in one town in one region.
Palestinian militant group Hamas has said it won't engage in any further ceasefire talks with Israel until prisoners are freed as part of the current deal. Israel has delayed the release of more than 600 Palestinian prisoners, claiming Hamas had breached the terms of the agreement. And a campaign group is threatening the government with legal action unless it reconsiders its rejection of compensation for millions of women who were impacted by the changes to the state pension age. The Prime Minister says any deal for WASPy women could cost taxpayers over £10 billion.
Yeah, great stuff, thank you. A little bit of breaking news to bring you as well. Russia's Consul General in Marseille has said there's been an explosion inside the consulate. That's according to Russian news outlet RBC. The Consulate General claiming that it has the hallmarks of a terrorist attack. Those lines are coming from a separate report, a Russian agency, TASS, who are citing the Russian Foreign Ministry. We'll stay across that development for you. But the Russian Consul General in Marseille is confirming that an explosion took place inside the consulate, according to RBC. More on that when we have it. Now, on this morning's episode of Politics at Sam and Anne's, is that right?
That is.
New headline?
Jack Blanchard has been replaced by Anne McElvoy of Politico.
There we go. So I thought when we teased it can't possibly still be Jack and Sam's. He deserved it because he's a great man. But his name remained in the title long after since that. But anyway, Politics at Sam and Anne's. What's the headline say? Looking back on the 3-year anniversary of the war?
Yeah. Look, this is 2025 is a year where the global impacts the domestic more than any other that I can remember. And You've got a week which is dominated not just by Keir Starmer on Thursday going to the White House, but President Macron today, as everyone scrambles to work out how to deal with the Ukraine conflict on, as you say, today, the 3rd anniversary. And perhaps the biggest moving part overnight, actually, are the elections in Germany. So obviously, we now have a new German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, who will take a different approach, possibly a more pro-Ukraine approach than his predecessor, Olaf Scholz. You've got the rise of the AfD, 20%, the highest for a hard-right party since the Second World War. Although there is absolutely no affiliation between them and Reform UK, there will be questions about the rise of the right in Germany and whether or not there are populist forces that can harness public sentiment in the UK. But I think the biggest thing at the moment is how that change in German government actually, which hasn't taken place. It's not like the UK. It doesn't happen overnight. You've got a couple of months of coalition building before Merz actually takes the job, but how that impacts negotiations. And here's a big thing, Wilf. The big thing that's happened overnight is having won that election, Friedrich Merz, rather than being conciliatory towards Donald Trump, has taken completely the opposite approach and attacked him.
And on top of that, again, as you say, come Easter time, after the coalition's formed, Europe has a very clear and powerful leader once again.
That's right, one who has at times, complicated relationship with Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, even though she is also a centre-right German politician. They're not peas in the same pod, we understand, who may well rub up a little bit against President Macron in France. But once again, you have a reinvigorated, potentially, but certainly a reshaped Europe as it tries to come to grips with what the EU and Europe's place is in this new world order, a new world order which has all been changed since Donald Trump upended it over the last 10 days, starting with his comments about Ukraine through that Munich conference and all through last week, as really European leaders try to work out just how they should deal with questions around European security now that the US looks like a lesser partner in providing a security guarantee for European countries.
I mean, it does sound like, you said it might clash with Macron, but on Ukraine and defence spending, it does sound like Starmer, Macron and Merz will be quite united, which is interesting thing to take away. Just to dwell on this election with you, Sam, of all people, and step back a little bit, the other massive takeaway, and we said this, of course, after the US election result as well, but if you snapshot the last year or so, and also perhaps look at the polls ahead of in Canada, the big takeaway, left or right, is that incumbents have been smashed to pieces.
Absolutely. Two big takeaways. Incumbents get smashed to pieces, regardless of whether they're left or right. And also, and this has been true really for a few years in global politics, people who call snap elections are very rarely the winners. And that's exactly what happened in Germany. To a certain extent, that's what...
He was forced, though. He didn't really call it.
There was a... I mean,
his coalition broke down.
His coalition broke down. His coalition broke down because he wasn't prepared to do some of the things his coalition partners wanted. You know, there's a little bit of chicken and egg there, maybe. But Rishi Sunak did very similar. He decided to go to the country early. That didn't pay off for the Conservatives last year in the general election. But
Macron too.
And Macron too. So you do have this question around incumbency that will, worry any incumbent leader. Now, we're several years in this country away from another general election, although there are local elections every year. There is questions about how leaders deal with the kind of populist forces that you're seeing all over the place, and we will see them in France with the rise of the right there, far right there as well. And that kind of challenge is something that I don't think any incumbent leader has really kind of managed to harness and work out how to deal with.
I mean, I still think inflation is a big factor. People always think inflation is not as bad as unemployment because it's just prices going up, it's not losing a job. The difference with inflation, it affects every single voter. And I think that's something that has definitely played a part in all these incumbents over the last couple of years. Just the other, again, dwelling on this point, if you see a coalition, which looks overwhelmingly likely, between the two main political parties, the CDU and the SPD, and both are saying, no, we don't care about the AfD. It's sort of akin to a Labour Conservative coalition while turning your noses up at reform. If you don't deliver a booming economy and peace in Europe over the next 5 years, I think we can all guess what the result will be in 5 years' time.
Absolutely. And you say that as if it's a hypothetical, but what's going to be very interesting in this country in that context is that next year we'll have devolved elections in Scotland and Wales. And then there's going to be a question like, what are the political parties' main priorities? In Scotland, is it more important for Labour to work with Reform to keep out the Scottish nationalists in order to contain separatism than it is to keep a firebreak with Reform, as you would expect them to do in England because of the political cost there? All sorts of really difficult questions posed by this effective reorientation of political leanings around the world, precisely for things like inflation, as you say. This week we've got the energy price cap. That's going to go up. That's going to push up inflation. This is a problem that hasn't gone away yet, even though it's not as bad as it was a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and I guess there's a bit more time, at least, for Labour to hold it off with no general election itself pending. Let's just talk quickly about the big trip this week to Washington, D.C. I mean, in normal times, we might have made more of the fact that Macron is getting over there first. I wonder whether it can help the Prime Minister a little bit if some of the big elephants in the room are discussed before he gets there, and almost like Macron takes a bit of the flak from the President for saying, sorry, Mr. President, actually Zelensky's not a dictator.
So you've got Macron meeting Trump, I think, at 5:15 p.m. UK time, and then a press conference at 7 p.m. I mean, I think every television in Downing Street will be watching that, hopefully on Sky News, that press conference to work out what it looks like, what it feels like. I mean, you had the humiliation of the King of Jordan at the hands of Donald Trump last week, where he went on about his plan for Gaza, something that the King of Jordan patently does not support. Donald Trump is not afraid to embarrass the person he's standing next to at the lectern. And I think there's the UK and Downing Street will want to get a flavour of just where Donald Trump is, because it does move. And Donald Trump has his own coalition of people who are of varying levels of hard line when it comes to Ukraine and what exactly should happen next. But leaving the rhetoric aside, let's just look at the kind of the specifics. One big question for the UK is what the US might be prepared to provide in perpetuity for Ukraine. Look, there is a question about whether or not there isn't method in Donald Trump's madness. Effectively, at this stage, he's trying to get Russia to the table, and then once Russia is at the table, negotiate very hard. In the event that that happens, could the US provide maybe some air cover, maybe some funding still? What might a guarantee or a backstop look like? And then what would Britain and France particularly be able to provide in terms of troops, in terms of support, not frontline support, but to Ukraine so that they can continue to prosecute their war? There are lots and lots of unknowns, but working out what the American bottom line of what it's willing to provide, if it is willing to provide anything, I think is the most important job, even if the kind of frothy conversation is about whether or not Keir Starmer talks about when he's going to commit to that 2.5% defence percentage.
Just quickly, fast forward to the end of the week for us. What's your estimation? Will we be applauding the Prime Minister for a very difficult job well done or not?
The UK tends to look at global affairs only through the eyes of the UK. At the end of this week, I'm not sure we will be significantly further ahead than where we are now. Perhaps more important than the Macron and Starmer meetings, this deal between the US and Ukraine on minerals, and there's a much longer game to be had when it comes to working out the end game for Ukraine and this conflict. So I don't think that Keir Starmer might have ended up being the most important moment in this conflict, however we present it on telly.
Sam, great stuff as always, whether it's on telly or on podcast. QR code there for you. The picture needs to be updated, but the same RSS feed that you can subscribe to there wherever you get your podcast. Now, 3 years on from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, here in the UK, Britain's armed forces are continuing to train Ukrainian recruits to help in the fight back. Let's bring in Ashna, who's on the ground there in East Anglia with some of the training taking place in and around. Ashna, what have you been witnessing?
Well, we have been given some quite rare access to the training compounds and the training facilities that would be used by the British Armed Forces to put these Ukrainian soldiers and test them to their limits, really. It's in places like this. They're essentially around this compound, this training village, lots of buildings that look exactly like this, built to recreate normal residential houses. Look at this one over here. They're all boarded up, but you can just imagine it wouldn't normally be this quiet because they'd be conducting their training exercises forces all the way along this entire village. It feels like it could be any town or village across the world, but it's deliberately made to look quite Eastern European looking. Some 51 Ukrainian recruits have been part of the British Army's training in partnership with 13 other nations. They work alongside places like New Zealand, Australia. They've got recruits, soldiers that are from Norway, from Denmark. But it's coming to places like this, facilities like this. You can just imagine the smoke grenades that would be going off, teaching them about trench warfare, teaching them about how to rescue civilians, perhaps. And let's remember that those people that would be part of this training would be ordinary volunteer recruits from Ukraine that have put their hands up to want to fight for their country. They've then essentially been put through this training programme, and in a matter of 7 weeks, the British Army, and alongside those partnership nations, have turned them into soldiers. And I've been speaking to the commanders this morning about how poignant it is to watch these people come as civilians and then turn into soldiers in a matter of weeks, and waving them off and saluting them as they know they're going on to the front line. The frontline combat is so much a big part of what they do, and so real is where I'm standing now. You've got places like a hotel, you've got a church, as you saw, residential houses, and you've also got buildings like this just for them to practice going in and out of. Normal things like a bus shelter, all with the idea of recreating this sense of town and village. But this is just a glimpse, really, into the work that the British Army have been doing for 3 years now, and that they plan to continue to do for the rest of the year.
But Ashna, a fascinating glimpse, and thank you for bringing it to us. Really very interesting indeed. Well, still to come on The Breakfast Show. After 3 years of war in Ukraine, the government announces more sanctions on Russia. We'll get the Conservatives' reaction. That's next.
We arrive. A secret hospital hidden in the Myanmar jungle, treating the victims of this bloody war. This is Myanmar today. Its military rulers don't want the world to see, but we have.
I fight for my own future. I fight for my generation's future.
This is an actual crime.
They don't care for that.
Myanmar army is only a couple of kilometers away. So this is a major humanitarian disaster.
Paris reverberated to the sights, sounds and smells of conflict.
There's a focal point to all this anger, and that is Emmanuel Macron.
I'm Adam Parsons, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Brussels.
There are dozens of people desperately clambering to get onto that boat. It is a chaotic scene, but it's being watched by dozens of French police officers on the beach.
I've reported on migration across Europe, close up on the ground, understanding that sense of desperation and meeting the criminal gangs behind it.
This old fishing boat set off from the Libyan port of Tobruk. There were 606 people who were on board.
So we've been distributing life jackets to all the people on board this boat, and now the first person is coming on board.
This is the ugly side of Italian football.
In Italy, everything is really organized.
Football's problems with hooliganism, racism were just dormant, and now they're back and they're getting worse. We cover so many countries, languages and cultures and work hard to gain trust to bring you the full story first.
Help is slowly reaching these places.
It's not just homes, but whole streets like this one that have been reduced to rubble and dust.
This is a picture of destruction.
Everywhere you look in this mountaintop community, there is absolute devastation.
These are the settlers in waiting, keen to start a new life, to annex Gaza for Israel.
The least we can do is just kick them out of our land.
Gaza, which is just 2 miles in that direction, is under attack again. Getting the chance to tell people's stories, it's a privilege.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. I'm ready. Are you? Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Welcome back. On the third anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the British government has set out fresh sanctions to hit the Kremlin, banning oligarchs with links to Putin's regime from entering the UK. Well, joining us now to discuss this is the Shadow Culture Secretary, Stuart Andrew. What do you make of this latest set of measures?
Well, look, we welcome anything that brings about pressure on Russia, because at the end of the day, today particularly, we are focusing on the fact that Ukraine is marking 3 years since this illegal invasion by Vladimir Putin. They have shown remarkable resolve and determination, as any sort of proud independent country would. And we should continue to do all we can to show to them that we are right behind them in the challenges that they've been facing.
What sort of level of defence spending, in light of all that has changed in the last month or so, what sort of level of defence spending do you think is needed to get the UK in a position it needs to be in?
Well, you're absolutely right to raise that, and I hope that when the Prime Minister meets President Trump this week, he will go there saying that he will follow the commitment that we had, which was to raise the defence spending to 2.5% by 2030, because it is right that Europe needs to step up. The security of our nations, each of our nations, is absolutely the number one task that any government should have. And if there are lessons to be learned here, we're in a more dangerous world than we've been in for some time. And so it is important that we raise that funding in the way that I've just outlined. And that was the proposal that we put forward. There is a proposal on the Prime Minister's desk, and I hope that he'll get on with it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't particularly want to revisit a long exchange I had with James Cartledge last week on the difference between 2.3 now and 2.5 by 2030. Forget what was said last year. Things have changed drastically this year. In light of the changes of the last month or two, is it not now needed more like 3 or 4 or 5%, as your former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace is saying?
Well, look, I'm talking about the proposal we've got that is costed. Now, obviously, when you're putting up, if you're going to go for an even bigger ambition, then you need to be able to show that it's fully costed. And that's something that, will need to take some time over. But there is already a plan on the table to get up to that 2.5%. And I think that's really important because, what the families and people of Ukraine have been going through over these last 3 years is just extraordinary. I've had the immense privilege to have had a Ukraine family staying with me for 2.5 years until recently. And I've seen the direct impact it has on them. The mother and the youngest son were living with us, but the father and the eldest son had stayed in the Ukraine with the eldest son fighting on the front line for a long period of time. And that has had a huge impact. The worry that the family that are here have about the family that are left back at home. And that's why it is right that we stand firm with them. And I'm glad that as a nation, we've done that. Across party, we have shown support for Ukraine in its battle against this illegal invasion.
What are your hopes that the new Chancellor, Friedrich Merz in Germany, can bring both on security and the Ukraine war and indeed on relations with the UK? Do you hope it'll be a fresh approach from Germany?
I certainly hope so. I certainly think that, the UK is one of the biggest spenders on defence in Europe. We have a leading role to play on that. If we can get Germany to come on board with that, recognising that there are threats to each of our nations' sort of security issues, the defence and security are a real priority, then working together, I think, in terms of encouraging nations, and particularly members of NATO, to increase their spending so that we can show that we are here and prepared to stand up in really important situations like this.
Finally, wanted to ask you an area of your wheelhouse about the football regulator. Can you clarify the Conservatives' position on this? Obviously, you introduced the idea in government. Are you still backing it, or have you U-turned?
Sorry about my dog barking in the background. No, look, on the football regulator, sorry about that. On the football regulator, we have been very clear that this is in Parliament at the moment. Labour have made some changes to that. We are going to look at those changes, and as this goes through Parliament, we will be doing what we can to try and improve it.
So ultimately, you're still in support of the idea of a football regulator?
So we're looking at all of the details. There's been significant debate going on in the House of Lords, some really important issues that need to be addressed. And that is what we're looking at the moment ahead of it coming to the Commons.
So what stands out that you don't agree with at the moment?
Well, what we want to make sure is that the balance is right. We spend an incredible amount of time making sure that we engage with the likes of the Premier League and the EFL to make sure we've got the balance right, because we don't want to endanger the success of English football. You know, the Premier League is something that is hugely successful around the world. We felt we got that balance about right. There are additions that Labour have put into the bill, and we just want to make sure we're looking at all of those details. And that is absolutely right for us to do that. It's really important that we take time to get this right, because what we want to see is the continued expansion of success of the English football, but make sure that it's on a sustainable footing. And those are the issues that we're looking at in great detail at the moment, ahead of it coming to the Commons and deciding exactly what we'll do.
But you're the Shadow Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. As it stands right now, would you be voting in favour of it?
Well, this is why I'm telling you, I'm not going to give you a yes or no answer right now, because I want to look at the absolute detail and all of the issues that have been raised. There's been some really important contributions being made in the House of Lords. It's right that we take time to consider those. I spent an enormous amount of time getting on this bill with the former the former Culture Secretary, Lucy Fraser, engaging right across the football world to make sure that we get it right. I want to see what impact some of these additions may have and see what changes we may need to bring when that bill comes to the Commons.
Okie doke. More time needed. Stuart, Andrew, thanks so much for joining us. Very much appreciated.
Thank you.
Now, ending on some of Hollywood's biggest names turning out for the Screen Actors Guild Awards, the SAGs. What's the main takeaway, guys? I think
for me, actually, it's Jane Fonda, 78, Lifetime Achievement Award.
Wow.
She gave a really wonderful speech about actually, you know, waiting for that moment in the spotlight might not come straight away. And for her, it came when she was 78 years old, looking just a wonder as she headed in to the awards ceremony. So that was my sort of alternative pick from the headlines today.
I fully support that pick. I didn't know that. I should have known that. And episode 3, just a little plug here, of David Frost is David Frost versus Jane Fonda. So
wow.
Good timing all round.
Oh, excellent.
Fantastic. Oh, she's fantastic. Anyway, we're out of time. So we'll get Mari's take on the SAGs next hour, and we'll have all of the day's news after this short break.
I saw police being forceful, pushing young men and women to the ground as they made almost 100 arrests. Will the cold affect your voters?
Well, we have a lot of tremendous support.
Free, wherever you get your news. The people here know that worse storms may well be on their way. I'm Martha Kellner and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Good morning, it's 9 o'clock. We've had an update on the Pope's health. We'll bring it to you momentarily.
Germany's far right surges into second place meanwhile.
And we hear from the former head of the British Army on the future of Ukraine.
It's Monday, the 24th of February. Your headlines. Germany's Conservatives celebrate success while the country's far right doubles its vote share. The Vatican says Pope Francis had a good night in hospital. He slept and is resting. Leaders begin arriving in Kiev for a summit on the third anniversary of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And Conclave takes the top prize at last night's SAG Awards. Next stop, the Oscars. We'll tell you why there's all to play for. A very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us here on Sky News Breakfast. Well, the stage is set for coalition building in Germany after yesterday's election. The country's Conservatives came out on top with almost 30% of the vote. But the story of the night was the surge in support for the far right, placing them in second position. The question now is whether the established parties will continue the long-held convention of a firewall, blocking the AfD from joining a coalition. Well, earlier I asked Germany's ambassador to the UK about the possibility of the far right surging should a coalition fail.
This is a danger, but not only in Germany, in many other countries. So the only way is really for governments to deliver on the key topics. And in Germany, that's economic reform, investment in infrastructure, migration, very similar challenges as we are facing, any government is facing in Europe, but also here in the UK. The only way is really delivery.
Our Europe correspondent, Adam Parsons, is live in Berlin for us this morning. Adam, the other kind of really interesting takeaway from the conversation with the ambassador was essentially saying it's decided. We know how the coalition will be formed. It's just a matter of time. Are we as certain as that?
I think a grand coalition between the CDU and the Social Democrats it is the most likely, because it would appear that between them, and it's a rather complicated electoral system, but it would appear that they would now have 50%. And if that's the case, I think it's probably largely a done deal, because that's the centre-right and centre-left. They've been creating these coalitions over the course of many years. That's why it's got this nickname, a grand coalition. And they are, to an extent, natural bedfellows and very familiar. And both of them would share a desire to stymie the AfD. So the negotiations could take a bit of time, but I think if they can get the seats and if they can get agreement, that's where they'll go. I think another big takeaway, by the way, from this election, looking at the data, is that only about half the country voted for centrist parties. Largely those two, but also the Free Democrats, who collapsed the last coalition. They've done so badly that they're not even going to be in, won't have any seats, because you have to get to 5%. But if you look at the disaffection that this election shows you with traditional centre German parties, it's actually quite striking. We've talked a lot about how the AfD got around 20%, but Die Linke, which is the left-wing and in some cases far-left party, put them together with the Greens, that's another 20%. So that is about 40% of people voting for anti-establishment parties. Then there's another party didn't get to 5%, who are anti-establishment. 4.7% of the nation voted for them. You're getting to nearly half of the German electorate are voting for parties who are quite radical, anti-establishment. This is the biggest, richest country in Europe, and there is this wave of discontent with mainstream politics that is making itself heard. So Friedrich Merz has got a lot on his plate as and when he takes over the job of Chancellor, I think, because he's got to, A, deal with this resurgence of the far right, B, this sense that the mainstream politicians aren't satisfying the public. At the same time, as we heard him this morning saying that Europe has to be more self-reliant, that it has to not rely on the United States. And he has accused the US of electoral interference. Now, he's referring there to Elon Musk rolling in behind the leader of the AFD, Alice Weidel. And guess who Alice Weidel has spoken to on the phone this morning? Yeah, she's had a chat with Elon Musk. So perhaps Friedrich Merz will have the opportunity to reshape Germany in a new form. But first and foremost, he is going to have to deal with some real tidal waves coming in his direction of discontent from home, of geopolitics, and also on the anniversary of the start of the war in Ukraine. Does he maintain the level of funding that Germany has given over the course of the past 3 years, the second biggest donor behind the United States? There will be those, the AfD and the Linke particularly, who probably will push for that funding to be cut. And also, what does he do about migration? Something that the AfD weaponized very successfully during this election campaign. At what point does he introduce much tougher controls on migration? That, I suspect, is something that Mr. Merz will probably prioritise.
Just finally, Adam, what about his views towards the UK and renegotiating Brexit trade terms? Is it going to be a more pragmatic, positive approach or more of the same?
He's a conservative, Robert, so I would imagine that he will look at this in a wholly pragmatic way. But that does raise a really interesting question, is that for most of the past decade, Emmanuel Macron has seen himself as being the leader of European politics. It may be that Friedrich Merz wants to have a bit more of that action. Olaf Scholz just simply didn't have the big enough personality to do that. But also remember, the president of the European Commission is another German, Ursula von der Leyen. It may be that Mr. Merz wants to play a much bigger role in European politics, and certainly one of those decisions would be, should there be closer trading relationships with Britain? Again, that may play into the question of whether Europe needs to start disentangling itself a lot more from the United States.
Adam, as always, thanks so much for that from Berlin this morning. Meanwhile, let's now go to the Vatican City and get an update on the Pope's health. Lisa Holland is there for us this morning. Lisa, what is the latest?
Well, all we really know from the Vatican at the moment is that the Pope is, in their words, resting. I think it's less about what they are saying and more about what they're not saying, in that with such scant information, they are not really telling us whether or not he's eating or not. So I think it's safe to say that he probably isn't eating at the moment, because a few days ago they would have told us that. There's no word also on his mobility, whether he's got out of bed. These are all, of course, worrying signs for the ailing Pope at 88 years old. Now, we know that yesterday at a news conference, the Vatican said that the Pope was showing early signs of kidney failure. So I think there will be concern now that other parts of the body are starting to cause problems for the Pope, in addition, of course, to the double pneumonia for which he was diagnosed on Tuesday of last week. We know that, of course, he is in hospital here in Rome. He has now spent 10 nights in hospital. He went in initially with bronchitis. That deteriorated to a respiratory tract infection and then on to double pneumonia. And I think that essentially every bulletin that we've had has pretty much given a more bleak picture with regard to the Pope's health. So for now, he remains in a critical condition.
Lisa, as always, thanks so much. Now, today, on the anniversary of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, leaders are gathering in Kiev. We can get the latest from Kiev. This hour, we're going to be hearing from President Zelenskyy as he addresses delegates. We'll bring that to you as and when it does come in. We might also get some comments as well coming in from Justin Trudeau of Canada. We've seen him arrive moments ago. And, of course, we'll also bring you any of the key headlines from the other attendees. Noted, of course, that President Macron is not there. President Macron instead is travelling to Washington, where he's expected to hold bilateral meetings with President Trump, including a joint press conference, which we'll have for you live on Sky News, something that no doubt the occupants of 10 Downing Street will be watching for any pointers or lessons to draw from it ahead of the Prime Minister's own meeting with President Trump later this week. Let's now bring in our Moscow correspondent, Ivor Bennett, joining us on the third anniversary, of course, of Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. And Ivor, this anniversary, is it seen as something to celebrate or commiserate in Russia? I guess that the tone of that will have changed a bit in the last couple of weeks.
That's right, Wilf. The tone has certainly changed. I don't think the anniversary is neither celebrated nor commiserated, actually. I think, really, Russia doesn't like to mark it at all. There are no official events to remember the anniversary, because this was not an anniversary that Russia wanted to reach, of course. Its so-called special military operation was supposed to be over in a matter of weeks. It was supposed to be ending with outright victory rather than peace talks or negotiations. So I don't think Russia wants to draw attention to that fact, and I don't think they want to draw attention to the losses either. Moscow doesn't publish its casualty figures, but according to the UK's Ministry of Defence, they believe more than 750,000 Russian troops have either been killed or wounded since the Kremlin launched its full-scale invasion 3 years ago. That being said, Russia doesn't pretend this war isn't happening. It's not embarrassed by it. There are signs all over Moscow reminding you of the fact that the country is at war, and servicemen are lionised. They are held up by society as things as people to emulate. And what's been really interesting, and I should just say actually that's because Russia views this war and frames it as a kind of existential struggle against the West, against a foreign enemy, in which Russia itself is the victim. And what's been really interesting to watch is how the mood has shifted in the last 10 days or so since Donald Trump announced that phone call with Vladimir Putin, and the mood has become increasingly triumphant because things are going, or appearing to go, increasingly Russia's way. So in Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin appears to have gained an ally. Relations with the US appear to be thawing. The Kyiv and Europe appear to be sidelined, while Russia is not only in the driving seat, it appears to be calling the shots as peace talks and negotiations get underway. So, okay, this third anniversary was not an anniversary they wanted to reach. It wasn't supposed to last this long, but you get the sense that Russia feels pretty happy about the situation it is in right now.
Ivor, great stuff as always there. Thanks so much, Ivor Bennett, for us there live in Moscow. Meanwhile, Number 10 has set out some fresh sanctions on Russia, and they're targeting billionaire oligarchs. Mari's here with more on that. Mari, I guess, give us the details of what's being announced and how significant it is.
So the government, especially the Home Office particularly, they have got this new raft of measures targeting Russian oligarchs. And really what they're saying is they're expanding the criteria by which they can essentially prevent people from entering the UK, exclude them from entering the UK. And they say this is about bolstering UK national security and the fact that some of these people might actually be a threat to national security in the UK. So they are expanding this criteria, and so there are kind of 3 bullet points of areas that are expanding. So, first of all, anyone who provides significant support to the Russian state. Second of all, those who owe their status or their wealth to the Russian state. And third, those who enjoy access to the kind of upper echelons of Russian state. As you asked Dan Jarvis, the minister, this morning on air talking about this, first of all, you were asking him, why haven't you done this sooner if it's so significant? And then you were really asking him, if these are really significant, are they really doable if the US isn't backing it up? And he kind of confirmed that, yes, essentially they were slightly irrelevant. I think we can have a listen to the exchange now.
This is precisely why the Prime Minister is travelling to Washington to have these conversations with the President later this week. Our relationship with the United States sits at the very bedrock, the heart of NATO, which is the guarantee of European security, and our commitment to NATO is absolutely unshakable. We are a key part of that, along with our allies in the United States, and that's why the Prime Minister will be in Washington having these conversations with the President.
But without trying to be annoying, Minister, that's a sort of tacit acknowledgement that what you're announcing this morning, unless the Prime Minister convinces the President to back it come the meeting this week, is irrelevant.
It certainly isn't irrelevant. What it is a tightening of the screw, applying more pressure to Russia. The announcement that we're making around excluding Russian-backed elites, that is something that hasn't happened previously. This is something that we're doing now. So this will prevent people travelling to the United Kingdom in the way that they have done recently. That's a good thing, and I think that will make a material difference. The sanctions that are going to be announced later on will put more pressure on Russia. So set alongside the support that we're providing for Ukraine, we are doing everything that we possibly can, working with international counterparts to try and bring this conflict to a conclusion.
So Dan Jarvis there, really kind of trying to move around your questioning and kind of waiting and seeing how that discussion later this week on Thursday goes with President Trump and Keir Starmer. And so I think it will be all eyes on how things go with President Macron today, as well as other diplomatic efforts that will be continuing before the meeting in Washington on Thursday.
And those meetings tonight taking place about 5 p.m. UK time, press conference to follow, will be glued to that. Just interestingly, the Conservatives did sort of say they support these latest measures, at least a similar tone. You know, I think everyone acknowledges it's not game-changing for Ukraine, but I guess on the anniversary they've decided they want to announce something, albeit what matters is what comes out of the White House in the week ahead.
Definitely. I mean, it shows, it's symbolic, really, if nothing else. Mm-hmm. It shows a signal of support for Ukraine, that despite President Trump's comments, nothing has changed, and therefore that kind of show of solidarity. And that's also valuable when it comes to political machinations and discussions.
Absolutely. Mari, great stuff. Thank you so much for that. Now time for all of the day's other stories. Leah's got those for us.
Oh, thank you so much, Wilfred. We're going to give viewers an update from the Middle East now. Palestinian militant group Hamas says it will not hold further talks with Israel on the next phase of the ceasefire agreement until prisoners who were due to be freed on Saturday are let go. Details coming to Sky News, hearing from Israel, who are saying it delayed the release of more than 600 Palestinian prisoners as it wanted guarantees from Hamas that more hostages would be freed without what they're calling humiliating ceremonies. Well, the White House has backed Israel's decision, saying it was an appropriate response to Hamas's treatment of hostages. Back here, and a body has been found in the search for missing runner Jenny Hall. The 23-year-old was last seen on Tuesday leaving her home in Barracks Farm, County Durham. Officers say the body was found in a remote area of Teesdale, and they don't believe at this stage that there are any suspicious circumstances. Elsewhere, a British couple in their 70s have been reportedly arrested by the Taliban in Afghanistan. Peter and Barbie Reynolds have run educational programmes in the country for 18 years. Their children say they were detained earlier this month, but the reason for their arrests is unknown.
Yeah, great stuff. Thanks so much for that. We're going to pivot back to Kiev. President Zelenskyy is holding a press conference of what is, of course, the third anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Let's listen in.
Where are we now? On the 24th of February 2025, 3 years after the launch of Putin's three-day attack on Ukraine, and we have more friends in the world than ever before. Nobody in the world believes the Russian lies about our country and our people, even those who became Russia's ally in the war, who lie together with Russia. They understand really what and whom they support. They can make different steps. They can earn some money on their relations with Russia now, but they will never earn respect. And our respect now for Ukraine, for Ukrainian men and women, and we also respect for your people, the people in your countries who have helped us save thousands of lives, who help us defend our skies and the front, who develop the production of weapons together with us to refill our arsenals, who helped Ukraine when we really needed it, when the world needed to hear what's really happening. And they are helping strong diplomacy for the sake of peace. Dear friends, this year must become the year of the beginning of reliable peace. Putin will never give us this peace. He will never exchange it for anything. We have to ensure it and get it through our unity and our joint work. It's not impossible to announce peace in just 1 hour or day, today, tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow. Unfortunately, this is our reality. And if somebody tries to do this without some support, this will not work without any security guarantees. Reliable, sustainable peace can only be at the front. We know that starting from 2014, Russia has violated the ceasefire 25 times. When General Kellogg was in Ukraine, I handed over to him and to the United States President, I handed over a list which lists all the ceasefires with specific dates which Russia violated. Therefore, the peace can only be the consequence of weighted diplomacy and concrete security guarantees. The war is against Ukraine. That's why Ukraine must be at the negotiating table together with Europe. Russia's strategic target is Europe, and the European way of life, its security, and the future of Europe. And the European future cannot be decided without Europe. Ukraine, Europe, together with America, we must be at the negotiating tables so that peace should not be based on promises about normalization or reset. Second, the end of the war should start with steps that renew trust and confidence in the very situation. And some of those steps should not just be to guarantee calm through cheap tricks. This is true. This is ready and there is an effective security system which has been working for decades, which prevented war at the border between NATO and Russia. And this, funding and contingents and defense production should be ensured, which will safeguard guaranteed peace. Can we do that ourselves? No. And I'm grateful to all of you and to all our partners who are ready to help us. Security guarantees are a key to peace, and the more reliable they are, the longer peace will hold. The fourth point, we have 28 security agreements with our partners, and all the participants in this meeting, they also represent those commitments that help us. These are all finance and defense issues that help us stop the widening of this war. And we should also agree on the bilateral basis to boost all the technological and other commitments to help Ukraine's air defense capabilities. We're now working on creating such a shield. Any agreements on air defense is very important, and we must create a system which would provide security and allow us to be independent through security. Europe should never allow itself to lag behind in global technological competition, but now there is such lagging behind.
We're going to continue to monitor those comments by President Zelenskyy on this, the third anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Let's bring in now Lord Dannatt, the former head of the British Army, to get his take. Lord Dannatt, very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. I guess, what would you say in response to the sort of tone that we're seeing there? Does President Zelenskyy have good reason to be upset today on this third anniversary?
Yes, I think he does have very good reason to be upset. He shouldn't be upset about the strength and the degree of support that his country is getting from our country and from other European countries. but I think he has every right to be upset at the stance that Donald Trump is taking and the things that Donald Trump has been saying about Zelenskyy and about Ukraine, and also Trump's endeavor to do a bilateral deal, it would seem almost over the heads of the Ukrainians, with Vladimir Putin. So I think President Zelenskyy has every right to be upset, when actually, frankly, we should be joining with them, as indeed we are, not celebrating, but congratulating them on the determination that they have shown over the last 3 years to defend themselves against the Russian aggression, which by any manner of international law is outrageous. One country should not attack the sovereign territory of another. So yes, Zelenskyy has every right to be upset.
Of course, America has poured billions, hundreds of billions of pounds into Ukraine in the last couple of years, and we saw a snapshot of how that can seem unappreciated, I guess, on the US side of things, by an interview that Marco Rubio gave over the weekend. Is there a lesson to learn from that for Keir Starmer ahead of his trip to Washington later this week?
I think I'll just run you back on the way you introduced that question. You said hundreds of billions of pounds. You said, let's call it dollars. Most observers would recognise that the United States has put somewhere between 100 and maybe 125 billion dollars into Ukraine. Donald Trump talks about 350 billion. Another example of him talking, frankly, things that are not true. And if you think that a cause such as supporting Ukraine to fight against the illegal aggression of Russia is something that should be transactional and should have a payback, then that's not the nature of giving. That's not the nature of support. To give and not to count the cost, to fight and not to heed the wounds, are not just words that are sometimes intoned on Sunday mornings, but they have real meaning. And I think the United States needs to realize that sometimes you give and you don't get back, because if you give for something that's important, then actually the importance of that is the justification in the first instance. So we are in a different position. We are in a changed environment. And I think we Europeans have got to understand that America, and within the context of NATO, America is going to dial down its support for Europe. It's going to dial down its support for NATO. It mustn't be allowed to completely leave NATO. And Keir Starmer has got to say that very clearly on Thursday in Washington. But if the Americans are going to dial down support for Europe, we Europeans have got to dial it up in the interests narrowly and immediately of Ukraine, but much more widely in our own security interests. And that's why at the end of the day, you can't get around any alternative conclusion, but that we and other European countries have got to spend more on defence. And frankly, just taking our own defence budget from 2.3 to 2.5%, yes, it indicates moving in the right direction, but in quantum terms, it's not enough. We should be going to 3 or 3.5%, end of story.
If, say, no one can suddenly double defence spending overnight, obviously. If by the end of, let's say, this calendar year, the UK government's conclusion is only boosting it to 2.5%, what would be your conclusion on that decision?
Well, pledging to increase to 2.5% and doing that now, and not waiting until the Strategic Defence Review is announced, probably now as late as June. It was talked about in the spring, but I think June is what is now being talked about. To announce that increase, that modest increase now, is important, because defence planners and programmers can begin to work out how to use that additional money. And critically, and this is where it plays into the government's wider agenda, they can start to place contracts with British defence industry, and that those contracts placed means that defence industries will grow, that will produce growth in our economy, and that all plays into the government's wider desire to grow our economy. And of course, if our economy grows, then the cake of public expenditure potential gets bigger. But it's got to be beyond 2.5%. Most analysts would agree that we should be spending between 3 and 3.5%. Now, that's a lot of additional money. So where's it going to come from? Well, there may be no alternative but to consider raising taxes. Now, This government was elected promising not to raise any of our major taxes, but that was in June, July last year. The world has moved on. The world has moved on dangerously since then. And when the situation changes, every leader, every government has got the right to reanalyze the situation and make different decisions if necessary. We are in a different place in February 2025 than we were in July 2024. And that being the case, if we have to raise taxes, we raise taxes and we spend more on defence, because you and I have every right to be secure in our lives and not have the potential of coming under Putin's Russian aggression.
Lord Dannett, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We're going to take a quick break here on Sky News Breakfast. When we come back, Donald Trump, of course, calling the Ukrainian president a dictator for not holding elections during the country's war with Russia. We'll get the facts from the head of Ukraine's election watchdog. That's next. Welcome back to the Breakfast Show. Coming up, we'll speak to the election watchdog in Ukraine after President Trump claimed Volodymyr Zelenskyy was a dictator. But first, reminder of all the day's top stories. Leah's got that for us.
Oh, thanks so much, Wilfred. The leader of Germany's far-right party has said blocking the AfD from joining a coalition would be undemocratic. The Conservatives came out on top with almost 30% of the vote and will now work to form that coalition. The AfD came second, doubling their vote share since the last election.
Friedrich Merz hat sich festgelegt.
Friedrich Merz has decided to maintain a blockade mentality against the AfD. We think this is undemocratic.
The Vatican says the Pope has had a good night in hospital, slept and is now resting, We're told yesterday the 88-year-old was in a critical condition and had developed a kidney problem. On the anniversary of Putin's war in Ukraine, the UK introduces a new raft of sanctions targeting the country's billionaire oligarchs. We report on the toll the war is taking on a generation of young Russian men.
The military graves are the ones marked out by flags, and there are dozens and dozens of them. And this is just one cemetery in one town in one region.
Elsewhere, Palestinian militant group Hamas has said it won't engage in any further ceasefire talks with Israel until prisoners are freed as part of the current deal. Israel has delayed the release of more than 600 Palestinian prisoners, claiming Hamas had breached the terms of the agreement. And a campaign group is threatening the government with legal action unless it reconsiders its rejection of compensation for millions of women who were impacted by the changes to the state pension age. The Prime Minister says any deal for WASPy women would cost taxpayers over £10 billion.
Yeah, great stuff. Thanks so much for that. We're going to return now to the top story of the day, of course, the anniversary of the invasion by Russia of Ukraine. And it comes, of course, after the US President Donald Trump had called President Zelenskyy a dictator for not having held elections in recent years. Let's discuss this topic and much more with Olga Iverzovska, who is the chair of the board of Opora, Ukraine's leading election watchdog. Thanks so much for joining us this morning, Olga. I mean, first, if I may, just ask you how you're feeling today on this third anniversary of the invasion, and in light of a lot of the changing nature of the rhetoric and the level of support from the West.
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm happy to be in Kyiv today after 3 years of full-scale invasion. This is the biggest success for my professional and personal life, because after full-scale invasion, I had to flee from Ukraine for some months with my child. Now he's in Kyiv and I'm in Kyiv. That's why I'm happy to continue to protect Ukrainian democracy.
What do you make of this comment that President Trump has made, that President Zelenskyy is a dictator?
This is a huge mistake to focus on the wording. But if, leader of Northern Korea or Putin is not dictator for President Trump, let's talk honestly that we have to fight for having democracy in Ukraine for sure, even during wartime, but not shaming the President Zelenskyy that he became dictator because we can organize elections during wartime according to Ukrainian constitution and according to martial law. That's why I hope that everyone from the free world can understand that democracy must be protected even more during wartime than during peacetime because of the price of mistake. If we will start unprotected elections without security guarantees, and Russia will attack Ukrainian electoral democracy during E-Day, and we will have just 10% of turnout or terroristic attacks across polling station, nobody will accept the result of that elections. According to Ukrainian constitution and our legislation, till the end of martial law, we can't have elections. That's why any peace process should take into account Ukraine's voice and logical sequence of the action to restore electoral circle. First of all, it's about sustainable ceasefire under the security guarantees of the very responsible countries, not just Russia. Then it has to be preparation for elections and restoration of the relevant infrastructure, because we lost the number of infrastructure which are very important for electoral process, and then holding elections after sustainable peace as achieved, martial law is lifted and the war was settled internationally. So we have to say and highlight that the majority of Ukrainian society now is highly mobilized because of Trump's statements, and we are going to protect our democracy. And even if Zelenskyy rating of support was a little bit lower than today because of Trump's statements, we are very well united because we want to have free and fair and real elections at the end of the war.
President Zelenskyy said over the weekend he'd be willing to stand down as president if it meant that Ukraine got NATO membership. What do you make of that? I mean, you're saying at the same time it's impossible to have replacement elections.
I believe that all the partners can start to support Ukraine for rebuilding electoral infrastructure now. I have to say that NATO countries and NATO headquarters will be today in Kyiv because it's the 3rd anniversary, and leaders of the many Western countries are today in Kyiv, and Kyiv is hosting them. So we will have many potential meetings from civil society to political leaders and actors for having conversations how to support Ukraine, for building measures for having elections very soon, but not today, not tomorrow, because Ukraine will have very weak position, and Russia will use the electoral process against Ukraine and will try to not just to provoke the fraud here, but to use as much disinformation, as much propaganda against Ukraine, that Ukraine will have the weakest position for defense itself. That's why elections is about potential process, but not tomorrow, not during half a year. We have consensus between political ruling party groups and opposition, civil society, and voters that till the end of martial law, we can have elections. But martial law was established just because of Russian full-scale invasion. And then if invasion will end, of course, Ukraine will start as soon as it's possible practical stage of preparation. Now we have to focus on EU integration, democracy building, fundamentals, reforms, and so on and so forth. And that will be the best support of Ukrainian democracy from our Western partners.
Olga, thanks so much for joining us. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Now, while a fragile ceasefire holds in Gaza, an ongoing military operation across the West Bank is causing unprecedented levels of destruction and displacement of Palestinians. Shortly after the start of the Gaza ceasefire, the Israeli military launched a major operation, demolishing homes in refugee camps and leaving neighbourhoods in ruins. Then, just this weekend, Israeli tanks moved into the West Bank for the first time in decades. Sky's international correspondent Diana Magnay travelled to Tulkarm and spoke to families caught up in the violence. A warning: this report contains the distressing moment when a Palestinian boy is shot, who then later died in hospital.
A bulldozer in the Tulkarm refugee camp demolishes homes in emptied-out Palestinian neighbourhoods. It's part of Operation Iron Wall, an Israeli military offensive targeting the northern West Bank with airstrikes, house demolitions and door-to-door raids, launched 2 days after the Gaza ceasefire was agreed.
And the Israeli soldiers did this?
Zainab Kassim shows us how Israeli troops ransacked her neighbour's apartment, ripping through their possessions and firing into walls, holding her children at gunpoint.
I have a daughter with special needs. She couldn't understand what was happening or what it means when a weapon is pointed at her head.
I was so scared. I even started crying. I was worried about my brother. They were so aggressive. They were screaming so much.
The family have had to evacuate 3 times since the operation began.
This has become a mini Gaza. If I showed you the streets just behind that door, you would say this is Gaza.
It's not on the scale of Gaza, but critics say the operation is a compensation of sorts to the extremist right wing who didn't want the Gaza war to end and who are holding up Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition. And it has already displaced 40,000 people.
Israel says this is about rooting out militant groups to make sure that another October the 7th doesn't originate from the West Bank. But if you look at the destruction, the fact that they've bombed homes, destroyed the infrastructure, taken out the water systems, the electricity, it looks very much like the ultimate aim is to make it impossible for Palestinians to return.
10-year-old Saddam Rajab was shot 1 week into the operation when he was on the phone to his mother. In CCTV footage, the child screams in pain and struggles to move. His father, who is on crutches, finally reaches him 2 long minutes later.
We called an ambulance. It came and carried my boy. I tried to join him, and before I knew it, 20 to 30 Israeli soldiers turned up. Where they came from, I have no idea. They detained us for almost an hour.
In two separate journeys, the ambulances carrying Saddam to hospitals were stopped and searched by the Israeli Defense Forces. Critical time that was lost. He never regained consciousness and died in hospital 2 weeks later. The IDF say they are investigating Saddam's case.
Let's assume their claims that they are fighting armed terrorists. How is a 10-year-old boy an armed terrorist? When his younger sister asks me daily, where is Saddam? I have to make excuses. When my youngest children grow up and learn the details, they'll be filled with resentment.
This conflict continues to claim innocent lives, each tragic case pushing the prospect of peaceful coexistence that bit further away. Donald Trump has said he'll be making a decision on the West Bank in the coming weeks. That is unlikely to account for the millions of Palestinians who call it their home. Diana Magnay, Sky News, Tulkarm in the West Bank.
Lots more to come on The Breakfast Show. When we come back, we'll have more on the results of the German election, and we'll hear from the German ambassador to the UK.
This is how you travel when the mafia wants to kill you.
He's almost given up his own freedom, but that's the price he's willing to pay.
Here, they don't just arrest and Ndrangheta mafia members, they also live among them.
Time after time, I've seen the devastating impact of extreme weather and climate change.
We don't have much snow at the moment.
They've had a warm spring and exceptionally hot summer, and that means they're expecting to lose more than 3 times the amount of ice than they usually do.
Flames are still forcing people from their homes and leaving many questioning their futures.
Here was my life. We have nothing. I can't say anything, it's so sad.
This disaster is testing the resolve of everyone on this island.
The only way out now is by boat.
Everything you see is devastated, and the misery being felt by people living here is repeated in towns and villages across Central Europe.
Sky News, get the full story first.
Turkey is burying its dead. The loss is profound.
Whole families died in this collapse, generations wiped out.
The violence has penetrated the heart of the city rather than being contained to the estates around the edge, and that speaks to the level of anger being felt here. In Sweden, police have seized a lethal stash. This is just a small sample of the deadly arsenal taken off the streets.
This is an example of an advert, really. Anyone of any age could say, I'll do that for £1 million, and then have to go and shoot someone.
Yes.
I'm Siobhan Robbins, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Berlin.
Weeknights on Sky News.
This is your chance. Tell people. Welcome to the Politics Hub.
Our police force has apologised. If you want to find out about Grimsby, you come to the docks.
I'm live in Jerusalem.
Are you not concerned that that could lead to all-out war?
Hello there, good evening. There are fears of an upsurge in violence. What's at stake here?
You are watching the press preview, a first look at the front pages as they arrive.
It's like better. Fly Emirates, fly better.
Welcome back. Let's return to Germany, where the Conservative Christian Democrats and their Bavarian sister party, the Christian Social Union, have won the country's national election. The German ambassador to the UK says they need to form a stable government as quickly as possible.
The Christian Democrats have won the election. There's only one viable option, and that is to work with the Social Democrats of Chancellor Scholz in what we call a grand coalition. Christian Democrats with Social Democrats.
Why is that the only viable option? Is it not fair to say that the two winning parties, the first two positions, could form a coalition?
Mathematically, they could, but politically, it's not possible. And the Christian Democrats, all parties in the political center, have ruled out to work with the far-right AfD. So they will be, with their 20%, the main opposition party in the German parliament, but no coalition with them. That was made very clear yesterday by Friedrich Merz.
It's clear that the CDU, of course, won the most votes. I mean, the other big takeaway, I think it's fair to say, is that it was a very bad night for the governing Social Democrats, SDP. Is it fair on the electorate that they get to stay in government?
That's the way how it works in coalition governments. Obviously, for them, it will be difficult. There will be some changes. Chancellor Scholz has already made clear that he will step aside. So there might also be, we'll see some new faces there. But, given the situation we are in, it's the only viable option to get a majority in parliament. And, we are in such a difficult geopolitical situation. That's why we need to form a stable government as quickly as possible in Germany. And that's what Friedrich Merz promised yesterday.
I guess there's a view sometimes from the UK that barriers to trade are erected for the sake of it as opposed to what's sensible. Will this be the start of a new sensible chapter of fresh negotiations on trade between the EU and the UK?
We would be glad to have these negotiations. We are going to have an EU-UK summit on the 19th of May. The government has laid out proposals for the reset with the European Union. And we are absolutely open for that. So no hard feelings there. It's an absolute openness. And I would even say, as I said, if we look at the world around us, but also what is happening in the United States, we need to cooperate in Europe on security, on trade, on investment, on many, many fronts, because our governments have to deliver. The only way to reduce the influence of the far right is by delivering on the key tasks.
And just finally, I guess, to bring it back to the AfD, the far-right party who got, nearly 20% and doubled their vote since last time. If a grand coalition is formed with the political establishment, the CDU and the SPD, and it fails, what will happen next time? The AfD will probably surge again.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. This is a danger, but not only in Germany, in many other countries. So the only way is really for governments to deliver on the key topics. And in Germany, that's economic reform, investment in infrastructure, migration, very similar challenges as we are facing, any government is facing in Europe, but also here in the UK. The only way is really delivery.
The German ambassador to London there speaking to me earlier this morning following the results of the German election. As you can see, I'm now joined by our Moscow correspondent, Ivor Bennett. And Ivor, as we start to wrap up the show this morning, wanted to get the very latest on that breaking news story that we brought our viewers earlier about an explosion at the Russian consulate in Marseille. What is the latest?
Yeah, details of that are still quite scarce, Wilf. So to begin with, we had local media in France reporting that an explosion was heard near the Russian consulate in Marseille. And since then, we've had some Russian media reporting that an explosion occurred inside the building. And they were quoting the consul general there. It still hasn't been confirmed by French police, but we've heard this morning from Maria Zakharova, who is the spokeswoman for Russia's foreign ministry, and she has told RIA Novosti, which is a Russian state news agency here, that the explosions have the signs of a terrorist attack. And she's called on the French authorities to launch a comprehensive investigation and also to step up security of Russian institutions and Russian diplomatic missions in France. It's still not clear exactly what's happened. It's not clear if there are any casualties or what the extent of the damage is. And it's also not clear if it's connected with the 3rd anniversary of the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, of course. But Russia is already suggesting, it seems, that they have been the victims of a terror attack, and no doubt we will get more information on this as the day unfolds.
Ivor, we were talking earlier about the fact that Russia's not marking the anniversary of the invasion in any sort of meaningful or big way. Interesting to hear, though, that President Putin has chosen, or at least in and around this date, to have a direct phone call with the Chinese president.
Yeah, we're just hearing this, that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have had a call today, and this has come from Chinese state media. But I'm just reading that the last call between them was on February 21st, so that was only 2 days ago. So apparently they speak quite frequently, and we do understand that Xi Jinping is coming to Moscow in a few months' time for the May the 9th Victory Day parade, the parade that celebrates the end of the Second World War here in Moscow. It's always a very big event. And of course, China and Russia have grown closer over the last 3 years, with the West freezing Moscow out. That has forced Russia to turn eastwards, really, to find new friends. And China has been, well, a very important lifeline economically, certainly, during the last 3 years. And Vladimir Putin has visited China a number of times in the last few years. And as I say, Xi Jinping will be coming to Moscow in the next few months. And it seems like, well, they've spoken today for the second time in a few days, we understand. So clearly that is a friendship that will continue to blossom, no doubt, as the war continues in Ukraine.
Very little time left, but I mean, presumably Moscow will be watching quite closely the tone as President Trump meets President Macron today and Prime Minister Starmer this week.
Yeah, that's right. Look, things have changed dramatically in the last 10 days or so, ever since Trump spoke with Putin. It very much feels like Russia is in the driving seat with these looming peace talks. They'll be watching intently to see what Europe sees they can get out of Washington when Macron goes and Keir Starmer goes later in this week. But I think for now they'll be pretty happy with their position.
Ivor Bennett in Moscow for us. We're out of time here on Sky News Breakfast. Darren McCaffrey up next.
I saw police being forceful, pushing young men and women to the ground as they made almost 100 arrests. Will the cold affect your voters?
Well, we have a lot of tremendous support.
Free, wherever you get your news. The people here know that worse storms may well be on their way. I'm Martha Kellner and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.